Hello everyone, welcome back to AMH 2020 U.S. Introductory Survey since 1877, and I'm going to explain the images on this title slide briefly. The left-hand side image is a General Electric ad featuring a returning U.S. serviceman and his girlfriend. It's not his wife, there's no ring on her fingers. And he's showing them the house that he's going to buy for them once they get married. The expectation during this period is that young men who were looking to get married would have a house purchased before they became engaged and married. And the second image on the right-hand side is of a suburban neighborhood in Los Angeles, California in the 1950s, and all the families seem to be moving in at once. In this video, we're going to discuss America in the early Cold War years, from roughly the end of World War II to about the late 1950s, early 1960s. We'll talk about U.S. foreign policy. In this period, we'll talk about the beginnings of the Cold War during the Harry Truman presidency and during the Dwight Eisenhower presidency. We'll talk about the policies that they advocate for, things like containment and domino theory. But we're also going to talk about everyday life in this period. We'll talk about post-war demobilization. We'll talk about American servicemen returning home, taking up jobs in the civilian workforce, what this means for American society. And we'll talk about how Cold War policies, how they impact American domestic culture. This is a period where culture and foreign policy are inextricably linked. The way you lived your life was part of the Cold War experience, and you see this with Americans' responses to the Korean War and to the rising conflict in Vietnam. You see this with McCarthyism and fear of communist infiltration. You see it with the Lavender Scare and concerns about infiltration of the U.S. government through certain LGBT communities, and then a clash of cultures as well. Capitalist American culture versus communist Soviet culture. And you see this in things like the kitchen debate between Richard Nixon, future U.S. president, and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier. And then also you have the baby boom that takes place during the post-World War II period. You have a whole new generation of Americans, the largest generation of American history, and they're going to be molded and shaped by this period. To begin, we usually think of the post-World War II period as a period of significant economic prosperity, and on the whole, it was. But there were some challenges too, particularly at the beginning of this post-World War II period. As World War II is coming to an end, as government contracts are winding down because they're no longer needed, because the war is over, there's going to be a 13% drop in the gross domestic product, and that's going to lead to, as you might guess, job losses. To make things more complex, you have returning American veterans who are looking to re-enter the workforce. In some cases, under the provisions of the GI Bill, they are required to be allowed to return to the positions they left behind for their military service. So there is some challenges, but as time goes on, the infusion of cash to American consumers, because Americans saved a lot of money during World War II because there were not many things to spend on, but wages were higher because we were at almost full employment in this country. There were Americans had money to spend, there was pent-up demand, and that in part is going to help bring an end to the post-World War II recession. And while there were some recessions and slowdowns during this period, and while inflation was a concern in this period, on the whole, this is a period of solid economic growth for the United States. You have about 5% GDP growth per year. So it's not a perfect period of American economic growth, but on the whole, it's a positive period economically. There's a reason it's called the affluent society. We can't forget the challenges, though, that Americans experienced as World War II was coming to an end. In addition to a recession, in addition to increases in unemployment, there were massive labor strikes after World War II from 1945 to 1946. And these strikes happen for a variety of reasons. Inflation does not keep up with wages, job competition as veterans are returning home, but the GDP is shrinking. There's the post-war recession that I mentioned on a previous slide. And there really had not been major strikes during World War II as well. Having a strike during the war would have been seen as unpatriotic, and it likely would have been suppressed. Strikes in World War I, for example, had been very, very harshly suppressed. So organized labor, generally avoided strikes during World War II. But now that the war is over, you might even say these strikes were overdue for the reasons mentioned in the first bullet of this slide. So you now have multi-industry nationwide strikes in the oil industry, in the steel industry, in coal, and in United Auto Workers, that make automobiles. What did the workers want? They wanted wage increases, and they got wage increases. But the thing was, public opinion really began to turn sharply against labor unions. There was a fear that these labor unions were being infiltrated by communists, and this did happen to a certain degree. There's always been radical infiltration in unions, but generally speaking, the radical infiltration is often greatly overestimated. And this turning of opinion against unions is ultimately going to culminate with the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. And these are the provisions of the Taft-Hartley Act. No more closed shops. Closed shops had become a thing during the Wagner Act back in the 30s, which increased the power of unions. Closed shops means you cannot be forced to join the union before your first day of work, which was a major hurdle for many employees, particularly women and minorities who in some cases were not allowed to join unions. Right-to-work states are going to be allowed under the Taft-Hartley Act. The right-to-work states are states where you are not required to join a union to work in a certain workplace, hence it's a right to work. This does weaken the power of unions, but it does allow businesses to be more profitable. And many of these right-to-work states they're more likely to be in the South and in the West, often what are called the Sun Belt states, places like Texas, New Mexico, all the way westward, and then parts of the Southeast as well, the Sun Belt. You'll see there's going to be a significant migration in the post-World War II years out of the Northeast, out of the Midwest. It's partially because of winter weather. People are fleeing the winter. It's partially because of the military bases and military projects, defense projects that are being done in the southern and western U.S. But it's also because jobs are opening up in these southern and western states because they're right-to-work states as opposed to union states. And to also make unions weaker, cross-industry strikes and secondary boycotts are banned, so you cannot have an entire industry go on strike. The entire oil industry could not go on strike because that would cripple the country economically. And secondary boycotts, so related industries, for example, they cannot call for boycotts in other industries to go along with their strike. It basically makes it more difficult for organized labor to, plan things across industries. And then the President of the United States is going to gain the authority to intervene in strikes if health and safety are a threat to or going to be threatened by these strikes. And also unions have to give a pre-strike notification period to allow their employers to have notice that a strike is going to begin and to have what is called a cooling off period where labor and management can negotiate possibly to avoid a strike altogether. Either way, though, this legislation, the Taft-Hartley Act, greatly decreases the power of unions. They had increased greatly in power in the 1930s thanks to the Wagner Act. Union membership increased drastically, as you can see on this slide's image. But the Taft-Hartley Act is going to decrease the power of unions. Here's the Wagner Act in 1935. And 1947 is when the Taft-Hartley Act is passed, roughly. You can see there's a little bit of a decline in membership, but the big decline in union membership really, you can see it happens more towards the end of the 60s and the 1970s. There's other factors that are really going to cause union membership to decline in America besides just the Taft-Hartley Act. As president, Harry S. Truman, President Truman, he vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, but his veto was overridden. Congress was controlled by Republicans and by Democrats that did not support labor unions. And as I mentioned, public opinion had gotten to be more negative about unions as well. So it was put into law over the president's veto. And the Taft-Hartley Act is still in effect today. And it has drastically weakened the power of unions in U.S. politics, but unions still have influence. They still have power, but much less than they did in the past. And union membership is going to decrease with time. And you see big drops in the 1960s and 1970s, but really the peak of union membership in America is actually in the late 1950s. So Taft-Hartley does lower the numbers a little bit. They rebound, and then in the 1950s they rebound, and then 60s and 70s the numbers really fall. And in future videos I'll talk about why that decline takes place. And this is our man, Harry S. Truman. He was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR's vice president for his fourth and final term. And Truman was different than previous vice presidents. He was different than John Nance Garner, the white Southern Democrat that FDR initially chose. He was different than Henry Wallace as well, the very committed New Dealer that FDR chose during his third term. Harry Truman was in some ways kind of in between John Nance Garner, the Southerner, the supporter of segregation, and Henry Wallace, who was very much of the intellectual elite, a very big supporter of the New Deal. Truman was kind of in the middle. Truman was anti-segregation. He took very concrete steps to end segregation in the U.S. military, for example. In other ways, though, he had almost a mistrust and a disdain, you might say, of the so-called elites and experts that were in the U.S. State Department and that constituted the U.S. government and the cabinet. Truman was from Missouri. He rose up in Missouri politics. Really, anti-corruption was his big issue. He did not come from a very wealthy family. He came from really a sort of on the edge of working and middle class background. He's actually the last U.S. president to only have a high school degree, and his middle name actually is S. The S doesn't stand for anything specific, and this is because both of his grandfathers, their first names began with S, and his parents couldn't decide who to name him after, which grandfather to name him after, so they just gave him the name S for his middle name. So he's a Midwesterner. He's anti-corruption. He does go against segregation. He is a supporter of government interventions. And he does support the New Deal in some ways, but he supports something called the Fair Deal, which I'll unpack a little bit more later. So anti-corruption is a big issue for Harry Truman. He's a bit more populistic than FDR as well. His mistrust of the elite is part of his populism, which makes sense. He's from Missouri. He's from basically what would have been populist territory in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He also served in World War I, as you can see from the uniform at the center of the slide. He was an artillery officer. He fired some of the last artillery rounds of World War I, and he also made the difficult decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. He also enjoyed bowling and long walks at night. Now I'm making it sound like I'm talking about his dating profile, but he liked to take long walks at night, and that really irritated the Secret Service, who were concerned about his security. So I want to unpack Truman a little bit more as a person and as a president. He's a very different kind of politician than FDR. He may be in the Democratic Party. He may support elements of the New Deal and government interventions in the economy, but his style is very different and his approach is very different. FDR was a refined, elite New Yorker of the upper class, the Roosevelt family. It's a family of presidents. It's a very well-heeled family. They send their children to Ivy League schools. Truman comes from a small town in Missouri, and he enters politics really with a focus on anti-corruption after World War I, after he had served in the military during the war. And the way Truman spoke, his manner of speech, the vocabulary he used was very different than FDR. FDR spoke with that very vaulted mid-Atlantic or transatlantic accent. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It almost sounds very British. And that was how upper-class American people learned to speak. It was a social accent. Truman didn't speak this way. He spoke like an everyday American. His accent is a little bit southern and a little bit Midwestern because he's from Missouri, which is kind of a borderland between the South and the Midwest. He also was known to curse in public, and that was something that was very on the edge in the post-World War II period. That's not something that FDR would have done. FDR would have been much too urbane to publicly curse like that. And, people, they had concerns about Truman when he inherited the presidency after FDR died. Was he up to being president? Was he just a token vice president that was chosen by FDR to improve his middle American election chances in 1944? But I think Truman rose to the occasion. He surrounded himself with FDR's old supporters, and he got to work. And he was successful enough ultimately to be reelected in 1948, in spite of the predictions that he would lose that election to Republican Thomas Dewey. The recession of 1945 to 1946 ended quickly. Truman did try to veto the Taft-Hartley Act, which he wasn't able to do so, or rather he did, but his veto was overridden. And as I said, for the most part in this period, the economy was pretty good. And how would I characterize Truman's political stance? In some ways, he was more socially and culturally conservative than FDR, coming from the Midwest, almost a late 19th century populist background, whereas FDR was really a early 20th century progressive who then became the architect of the New Deal. And he still supported a lot of New Deal safety nets, but he wanted to do it in a different way. Instead of the New Deal, it was going to be the fair deal, and it was going to be less wasteful and more efficient and less corrupt. Remember, anti-corruption is a big thing for Harry Truman. And he realizes this because he needs to work with Congress, which is controlled by conservatives from both the Democratic and the Republican Party. And as I said, he's more of a populist. It's his background coming from Missouri, and also just the way he speaks, the way he treats people in the government. He may have worked with some of FDR's former supporters, but he was very mistrusting of government bureaucrats and the so-called, what we might call today, the experts. For example, the State Department officials who Truman often clashed with, he called them the striped pants boys. And he meant that in a very derisive way because at the time in the State Department, people wore fancy suits, basically like jackets with tails and striped pants. And that was too formal, too academic for Harry Truman. So he called them the striped pants boys and often did the opposite of what they advised. And here is a map of the 1948 election and cartoons related to the election, as well as the famous Dewey defeats Truman newspaper image. And in addition to anti-corruption, in addition to the fair deal, Truman also was very concerned about legacy. He wanted to differentiate himself from FDR. He wanted to come out of FDR's really massive shadow. He won 4 presidential elections. And I think Truman is able to do that, especially after he wins his election in 1948. People expected Thomas Dewey, the Republican, to win. Polls had Dewey in the lead. To make matters worse for Truman, he was dealing with not one, but 2 spoiler candidates. He was dealing with a Southern Democrat or states' rights Democrat named Strom Thurmond, S-T-R-O-M, Thurmond, and he's often what is called a Dixiecrat, a white Southern Democrat that broke from Truman because Truman supported desegregation. At the same time, Henry Wallace, he is going to run as a progressive candidate. It's also going to be a spoiler candidate. Truman was not progressive enough. He was too mistrusting of the administrative state, you might call it, And so people like Henry Wallace, they are going to run as alternates. In addition, Wallace also disagreed with Truman on foreign policy as well. Truman wanted to take a harder line in the Cold War. Wallace wanted a softer line with the Soviet Union, in addition to also supporting more of the old New Deal, whereas Truman had his fair deal. But, newspapers, they print their articles, in the wee hours of the morning to get ready for the morning paper. But they printed that Dewey would defeat Truman, which, of course, Truman had a lot of fun with after the incorrect newspaper headlines came out. Here are some images related to post-World War II economic prosperity. Um, People are purchasing automobiles again after not really being able to do so during World War II. They're purchasing homes. Either it's returning veterans purchasing their first home, or families having children, multiple children, and needing bigger places to live. We'll talk about suburbanization and purchasing of consumer goods later in this video. In addition to purchasing homes and cars, consumer goods are available again after being largely unavailable during the war because General Electric and Westinghouse, they're making war material rather than civilian consumer goods. And the slide has a chart on the right-hand side that has our spending, family or domestic household spending. What families would be spending their income on roughly in terms of how much is going to food, how much is going to clothing. And what you can do is you can take a look at 1950, solidly into the sort of post-World War II prosperity. You see that Americans spend less proportionally of their budget on housing, about 30%. Housing-related costs, whether that's rent, mortgages, that's going to include things like home improvement as well. Could include your utilities and things like that. But they spend considerably more, closer to 40% today. So you're spending less of your paycheck on your housing in this period than you are in the 2010s and beyond. And then transportation, you're spending more on your transportation. I'm going to get into some of these stats a little bit more later. You're spending more on transportation nowadays than you did back then. And then other things, though, actually were proportionally more expensive in the post-World War II period. Not everything was cheaper in this period. Clothing, for example, people spent a lot more on clothing in the post-World War II years than they do nowadays. And there's two reasons for that. One, it's the type of clothing people wore. People dressed more formally back then. But also, you don't have as much international trade, global trade, and imports of clothing, which makes clothing prices a lot cheaper. In this period, this post-World War II period, people generally owned fewer clothing items, but they were of better quality. But they ultimately were spending more of their budget on clothing and on their appearance. I'm going to break down post-World War II consumer culture and the growth of the American middle class. Of course, we had a middle class before the post-World War II period, but I think it's really in this period from the mid-1940s through the 1960s or so, mid-1960s, that kind of what we think of as the 1950s period, even though it's not just the 50s. This is the period in which middle-class American culture becomes the dominant American culture. It becomes quintessentially American, you might say. And to begin, remember, Americans' wages have been high during World War II because there was almost no unemployment. There were government contracts available. And unions remained powerful during the war, and they remained powerful after the war, even with the Taft-Hartley Act. Unions were more powerful in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, even with Taft-Hartley, than they are today. And this allows for middle-class people and working-class people to have really good wages, and really, in some ways, it allows working-class people to live more like middle-class people. Also, the United States is a net exporter of products. We are selling things out of the country more than we're importing, so we're making money from other nations' economies as opposed to putting our money out into the economies of other nations as we do today. Some economic historians call this the golden accident. In World War II, the American economy had ramped up for the war. We were producing more than all the other belligerents in that conflict combined. And remember, the most developed nations in the world were taking part in World War II. And then during the war, British, German, to a lesser degree Italian, French, economic centers had been devastated, in some cases destroyed by the war. So we don't have competition, economically speaking. We're able to sell our goods to other countries. We're not bringing in as much. It's this war in some ways. It happens at just the right time. The American economy grows stronger. The economy of other nations grows weaker. It helps to make this prosperity possible. And of course, unions were powerful even after Taft-Hartley. New Deal legislation had caused them to get more powerful. Taft-Hartley scaled this back, but there's still abundant jobs in domestic manufacturing, even though some of these jobs are moving to the Sun Belt, to the right-to-work states. There's still ample manufacturing jobs during this period. There's a shortage of laborers as well in this post-World War II period due to lower immigration numbers as well. Only about 5% of the U.S. population is foreign-born during this period, whereas it was about 15% around the time of World War I, and that's more like what it is today. So there are fewer workers, there are higher wages, we're selling things out of the country a lot more, so that's going to bring a lot of prosperity to the American economy. And there just were not that many things to spend on. There was a lot of pent-up demand. During the war, there was rationing. There were not certain goods like new cars and new appliances. They weren't available. And the culture during the war was all about saving and about frugality. We had to work hard and make sacrifices to help our boys in the Pacific and in Europe, and also to help other nations, help our allies, whether it was the British or even the Soviets. So there's cash infused in the economy. This does cause some inflation, but it also means that American households have increased purchasing power. Big business is also going to retool and produce consumer goods again. Automakers that have been making aircraft and tanks are going to go back to making civilian automobiles, and factories are going to make appliances and consumer goods. And they're not just doing this for the profit motive. This becomes tied up in the Cold War. It's about American capitalism and free enterprise and against a Soviet communist command economy. In the agricultural space, farmers are going to grow food to feed hungry domestic mouths as rationing comes to an end. We're going to be able to sell food abroad as well. And again, the economy is rebounding after it has been retooled. There were some strikes. There was the Taft-Hartley Act, but on the whole, things are positive economically during this period of the 40s, the 50s, and early 1960s. And the U.S. government wants to really tout the strength of the American economy. It wants Americans to be aware of how many choices they have as U.S. citizens living in a democratic society, a society with capitalism, a society with free market economics, a society with a really rapidly expanding industrial center, to get Americans to support the Cold War and to get them to not want to support communism. And this is really going to become important after 1948 when the Cold War begins. These are shipping containers. They were developed from 1955 to 1956. And this is the top of the slide is the USS Ideal. It's the first dedicated container ship. And the containers and container ships, which can be loaded onto ships with cranes, then loaded onto the back of semi-trucks, they're going to drastically lower global shipping costs, and they're going to really usher in the era of globalization, global trade, global economies, internationalism, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes it's called large planet economics. You really see that with you're studying foodways and food importation and exportation. And this is going to help make consumer goods cheaper as they can be imported from other countries, especially developing countries that are becoming industrialized for the first time. These industrializing countries, these so-called third world countries, they need jobs, they need investment to prevent the spread of communism. The thing is, though, they're selling goods in the United States. This is going to eventually lead to a loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States. So there's a dark side for this global shipping that's developing during the post-World War II period. But really, you start to see the loss of manufacturing jobs in large numbers more in the latter part of the 1960s and into the 1970s. Even though this technology comes online in the 50s, it takes time for it to catch on. We're now going to shift gears and talk about U.S. foreign policy after World War II and the beginning of the Cold War era. During World War II, the Soviet Union became an ally of the United States after they were invaded by Nazi Germany in Operation Barbarossa. The United States sent Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. This was very expensive and very dangerous for American merchant sailors and Navy sailors, but it was an important part of ensuring the Soviet victory on the Eastern Front. And the Soviets will push to the west towards Germany. They will liberate Czechoslovakia. They will liberate Poland. And they will also defeat the Nazis' allies in places like Bulgaria and Romania and in Hungary. And the agreement between the Allied leaders, first between FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, and then later President Truman represents the United States, was that the Soviet Union would allow for fair and free elections in the countries that they had liberated, and that those nations would have self-determination, and that the great powers on the winning Allied side would not use the war for territorial aggrandizement. Well, that's not really what happened. Instead, the Soviets sponsored elections in these countries in which communist governments took over, and then the Soviet military backed those governments that were elected under very dubious circumstances. There were forced relocations of people groups. Some ethnic groups were basically taken into the Soviet Union. These were groups like the Cossacks, for example, who had in some cases actually worked with Germany against the Soviets. Many of them were sent to forced labor camps and places like that. German people, ethnic German people, were forced out of Western Poland, which originally had been, or previously had been, Eastern Prussia or East Prussia. And this was something that was not just done by the Soviets. The Western Allies played a role in this as well. So this post-World War II demobilization involved the redrawing of maps and of ethnic groups, and in some cases a lack of self-determination. This was happening during the years following World War II, and it's going to lead to tensions between the Soviet Union and between the Western powers. And I should also add, there was tension even during the war. In 1944, there was the Bretton Woods Agreement, which the Soviet Union did not take part in. They did not want to link themselves to the American-led monetary system that made the dollar the world's reserve currency. And I do want to try to be as objective as possible. There is a reason that Stalin would want to set up these buffer states on Russia's western border. There are not many natural obstacles between Germany and between Russia, and he wanted to prevent another Operation Barbarossa. He was a committed communist, but he was also a nationalist as well, and he wanted to ensure that the Soviet Union would not be invaded again and lose millions of its own people, because the Germans did not just fight against the Red Army; they also killed millions of civilians in Eastern Europe. Well, I don't think the setting up of the Eastern Bloc was right. I do think it was understandable. I also want to point out that just because a nation is communist doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be an ally of the Soviet Union or controlled by the Soviet Union. The prime example of this was Yugoslavia. You can see them in purple on this map on the right-hand side. They were an ally of the Soviets until 1948. This is because Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union disagreed about how to handle a communist revolution in Greece. Stalin and the Soviets, they supported the communist insurgency in Greece, as did Joseph Tito, leader of communist Yugoslavia. But Stalin and the Soviets stopped helping the communist insurgency, whereas Tito continued to help the insurgency. In the end, the insurgency was defeated, but this disagreement over Greece led to a rift between communist Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. And as I mentioned before, there are different types and different schools of thought within communism. Albania breaks away from the Soviet Union, Soviet sphere of influence in 1960 because in the late 50s and early 60s, under Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union began to move away from Stalinist communism, and Albania continued to be committed to Stalinism. We've touched on Eastern and Central Europe, what happened to those nations after World War II came to an end, as they were, some might say, liberated, others would say occupied by the Soviet military. We also talk about Germany. Initially, one plan for what to do with Germany was the Morgenthau Plan. It was named after Henry Morgenthau, FDR's Treasury Secretary. Morgenthau proposed making Germany an agricultural, non-industrial state that would be basically divided into smaller countries, which would be supervised and partially occupied. And this plan was favored by the Soviet Union, that really wanted to punish Germany and see to it that Germany would never rise again and ever be a threat ever again, which is understandable considering the Soviet experience during World War II, millions of Soviet military and civilian casualties. The Soviets also wanted to deindustrialize Germany. That way they could take that industrial equipment and machinery back to the Soviet Union to rebuild their own damaged economy and infrastructure. The Western Allies initially supported the Morgenthau Plan, but they moved away from it and resolved instead to rebuild Germany, or at least rebuild the parts of Germany that they occupied. The western part of Germany is jointly occupied by the United States, Britain, and France, and the eastern portion of Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union because that was how the country was invaded during World War II. And the idea is we're going to try to contain communist Soviet-backed expansion in Europe, and we're going to do that by rebuilding Western Germany or West Germany. This is part of what is called the Truman Doctrine. And the last thing I should mention, too, is that Henry Morgenthau was of Jewish ancestry, and the Holocaust experience certainly played a role in his advocacy for the Morgenthau Plan, this punishment and dissolution of Germany, this making them a weak kind of agricultural state, as you can see on this piece of artwork here. But there was concern that overly punishing Germany could just create another World War situation. Instead of preventing war, it could actually lead to another war, because Germany had been very harshly punished by the Treaty of Versailles during the years following World War I. That led to the rise of Hitler. So in the end, the Morgenthau Plan was abandoned, I think for good reasons. As relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the West and the East, deteriorate, President Truman creates the Truman Doctrine of foreign policy and the Truman Doctrine of relations with the Soviet Union, with communist nations. And the Truman Doctrine, ideologically and philosophically, is largely underpinned by the doctrine or strategy of containment, which was primarily articulated by U.S. diplomat George Kennan, who you can see at the right-hand side of the slide. Kennan had been in the Soviet Union as an American diplomat in the 1930s, and he was considered by many at the time to be an expert on Soviet culture and politics and motivations, and on what might be called the Russian or the Soviet psychology. In this period, they thought more in terms of people and nations having kind of a collective psychology in a way that we don't really do today. And containment under Kennan and then under Truman, in his Truman Doctrine, it calls for the halt of the growth of the USSR and of Soviet satellite states, and really the spread of communism, that communist countries will be allies of the Soviet Union. And we can accomplish this by supporting capitalist European countries and newly independent former colonies across the world and usher them into the Western liberal capitalist democratic fold. And containment is going to become a critical doctrine in the U.S.'s Cold War effort. And as time goes on, containment will become more aggressive. Containment will also be augmented with new ideas like domino theory, that if one nation or region falls to communism, other nations in that region could fall to communism as well. And you see containment with the establishment of multilateral organizations, not only the UN in 1945, which the Soviet Union was a member of the UN on the Security Council, but also with the founding of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949. NATO was created, in the words of its first Secretary General, to keep the USA in, Russia out, and Germany down. And then U.S. foreign policy will also continue to be more aggressive with the release of NSC 68. Technically, NSC 68 wasn't released until 1975, but it was a secret National Security Council document that said the United States needed to arm itself militarily and build up its weapons supply, particularly its nuclear weapons, in anticipation of the Soviet building up its weapons supply as well as its own nuclear weapons. And you really see NSC 68 in many ways was prophetic with the beginning of the Korean War, which began later in 1950. As part of the beginning of the Cold War, as we move away from the Morgenthau plan of punishing Germany, we're instead going to focus on rebuilding Germany and really rebuilding Europe. The Marshall Plan is named after George C. Marshall, the U.S. Secretary of State, and it's a plan in which financial aid will be offered to European countries to help them rebuild their infrastructure and rebuild their economies. The idea is it's going to make Soviet support and communism less attractive. We're giving them seed money so that they will adopt capitalism and adopt democracy and be allies of the United States. About 12 billion US dollars, or about 120 billion today, were spent from 1948 to 1951. And most of this aid actually goes to formerly Allied countries, France, Great Britain, but about 11% of it does go to West Germany. And the USSR prevented the Eastern Bloc countries, the countries that were east of the Iron Curtain, from getting Marshall Plan aid. And scholars will debate the effectiveness of the aid. It is a lot of money, but some would say that Europe would have rebuilt anyway, even without it. But the thing is, what I think was important is it was a gesture of goodwill. It showed struggling European countries, some of which were our enemies like Germany, others were our ally but had been devastated, that communism was not the way to rebuild. Capitalism was the way to rebuild. Here's some money to get started. And that's, I think, really what made the Marshall Plan successful, was its symbolic meaning. And the cartoon on this slide, it's about the Marshall Plan. It shows the Iron Curtain at center, separating Eastern Europe and Western Europe. The Iron Curtain was a term that was actually used by Winston Churchill to describe the communist takeover of Eastern European nations. But on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, you have the hammer and the sickle. You have Premier Stalin, working people in fields, in great poverty. It's a very pro-Western, pro-Marshall Plan cartoon. Whereas in Western Europe, you have tractors, you have happy farmers plowing their fields. And Stalin is saying it's the same thing, just without the mechanical problem. So it's a pro-Marshall Plan cartoon. So when does the Cold War begin? That's a debate that scholars have. I think it begins about the year 1948 with the Berlin airlift, which I'll talk a bit about more in a moment. But relations between the Soviets and the Western Allies had been tense for years before 1948. They were even getting more tense before World War II was even fully over. But I'm going to talk about the start of the Cold War for a moment on the next slide. And what you're seeing on this slide is scenes from the Berlin airlift. American and British pilots delivered supplies to the people of Western Berlin. They even delivered candy, which they dropped from the planes. These aircraft, which had brought death and destruction, were now bringing life and food and fuel and support. And this is the Berlin airlift. So 1948 is usually the year that scholars will point to as the beginning of the Cold War, with the United States and its allies really facing off against the Soviet Union and its allies. And they point to the Berlin airlift of 1948 to 49. They also point to the communist coup in Czechoslovakia. Again, the Soviets sponsored elections in some of these countries that delivered communist governments. Then they backed those communist governments. In some cases, they also sponsored coups in countries that were supposed to have their own self-determination. So that's something that's going to be very provocative to the Western allies. It was a violation of previous wartime agreements. And while it's understandable from Stalin's perspective, it was not seen as understandable from the perspective of the West, or even from the perspective of the people living in those countries that are being taken over. Fewer people, I would say, overall point to the Greek Civil War. The Greek Civil War I alluded to before. It's a conflict that took place from 1946 to 1949. It was a proxy conflict. The Cold War was a Cold War. It was not a hot shooting war. It was proxy conflicts in which the U.S. and the Soviets would not directly fight each other, but indirectly through proxies. And the Greek Civil War was a proxy conflict, but it was an older proxy conflict that the United States inherited from Great Britain. The U.S. will back the Greek monarchy against Soviet and Yugoslavian-backed communist insurgents. Basically, the British have been backing the monarchy before, but Britain doesn't have the resources to do this anymore. So the U.S. will step in. So we don't really point to the Greek Civil War because it was a conflict that was inherited from the British, even though it was a proxy war, which you're going to see throughout the Cold War. But the blockading of Berlin and the Berlin airlift, I think, is probably the best definitive beginning of the conflict. So what happens is Berlin is divided between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, Britain, France, and the United States. But Berlin is deep inside East Germany, the communist German Democratic Republic, the GDR. And in response to the Western Allies combining their occupation zones in West Germany and also introducing a new Reichsmark, or rather not Reichsmark, Deutschmark, German mark, German currency throughout the west of Germany, that led Stalin to close off Berlin from resupply via rail lines and via trucks and roads. Basically, starve out the Western Allies out of the western parts of Berlin. Again, he can do this because Berlin is deep inside East Germany. So this is a major threat for the people in Western Berlin who need food, who need fuel, and in response, the United States and Britain will organize the Berlin airlift, in which aircraft will bring in food, fuel, supplies, and even, as I said, they'll bring in candy and things like that. And really, it's a really successful operation. Berlin is kept resupplied. It showed the power of Allied and capitalist logistics and aircraft technology. The Soviets, they struggled with aircraft technology compared to the Western Allies during World War II. And also, aircraft wasn't quite as essential for their strategy in World War II anyway, but it was a success for the United States and a success for the Western Allies. It showed the altruism of capitalism and of the democratic West compared to the authoritarianism and the communism of the Soviet Union, who was starving the West Berliners. And the airlift will continue into 1949. The success of the airlift in part plays into Harry Truman's re-election in 1948. The operation went off fairly successfully, quite successfully. And the success of the Berlin airlift, they galvanized the Western Allies. They make the Soviets look kind of bad and authoritarian. But generally speaking, the Berlin airlift and events in 1948 are seen as being the beginning of the Cold War. So you could also lump together things like the communist coup in Czechoslovakia, and the Western Allies uniting their occupation zones in West Germany and introducing a new currency into the country as well. So 1948, I think, is a very safe beginning for the Cold War. Now we'll turn our attention towards Asia, where the Cold War heats up and intensifies. With the Soviet entrance into the Pacific theater in World War II in August of 1945 and the subsequent defeat of Japan, the Korean Peninsula, Japanese territory since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, was divided along the 38th Northern Parallel. And the Soviets would administer the North until 1948, setting up a communist government in their sphere of influence in Korea, and the Western Allies would run the South until 1949, setting up a capitalist, non-communist government in the South. And since the end of World War II, communists under Mao Zedong had taken control of China by 1949, due in part to the Truman administration's ending of support for the nationalists' Kuomintang or KMT party, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was deemed by the Truman administration to be corrupt, to be basically a fascist, and he was denied military support by the Truman administration. It's true that there was corruption around Chiang Kai-shek. It's true that his nationalist ideology did bear some similarities to fascism, but he had been an ally of the United States and of the Allies in World War II fighting against the Japanese. As had Mao and the communists, the CCP, they'd also fought against the Japanese. They'd also fought against each other during World War II as well. Officially, they had made peace temporarily, but what was happening was Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists were often fighting Mao and the CCP, and Mao and the CCP, their strategy was different. They focused on basically infiltrating nationalist military organizations during the war and then after, which played a role in their victory. Finally, I think the Truman administration was also given some bad and incorrect intel about the situation in the Chinese Civil War on the ground in China, in some cases by communist sympathizers that were in the State Department. So either way, the Truman administration chose to no longer support the nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek and his followers fled mainland China and set up in Taiwan, which remains as an independent country as of 2025, although mainland CCP Chinese claim that Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic of China. And communist North Koreans had assisted the PRC in coming into power, and then the Chinese Communist Party returned the favor by supporting a communist insurgency in South Korea. And the United States worked to try to create a nationalist, anti-communist government in the South Korea region, and they were largely successful. They cobbled together right-wing and conservative elements in South Korean society. They also brought in some nationalist Chinese that had fled to Korea instead of Taiwan. In some cases, they even worked with those that had supported the Japanese during World War II, and they were able to suppress, South Korea was able to suppress this communist insurgency in their country, but it was a very difficult battle for the ROK, the Republic of Korea. And with material support from Stalin and Russia, and then manpower backing from China, the North Korean army under Kim Il-sung, the dictator of North Korea, it will cross the 38th parallel on June 25th, 1990. And the ROK, the Republic of Korea's army, was very low on supplies, very physically exhausted from their counterinsurgency, and they're going to be overwhelmed by the North Koreans, who have significant Chinese and Russian support. And almost all of the Korean peninsula is going to be captured by the North Koreans by September of 1950. Seoul, the South Korean capital, will be captured, and what's left of the South Korean military, as well as some U.S. forces that were still in the country, are going to basically be confined to what is called the Pusan perimeter around the port city of Pusan on the eastern coast of the South Korean peninsula region. When President Truman heard about North Korea and its allies invading the South, he said to his secretary, Dean Acheson, "Dean, we got to do something about these SOBs." Except he didn't say SOBs in true Truman fashion. Now, President Truman knew that the American people would be uncomfortable with a full-scale war in Asia. This is only 5 years since World War II has come to an end. Also, we don't want to risk the Cold War going hot. So instead, the United States will appeal to the United Nations Security Council, the UNSC. It will condemn North Korea's invasion, which was backed by China and the Soviet Union. And it will call on member states to assist the South. By the way, the Soviet Union was on the UN Security Council, but they were boycotting the meetings at the time. And 16 nations in all, alongside the United States and South Korea, will contribute troops to the Korean War, or really it was the Korean Police Action. That was the language used by President Truman. And there was no congressional declaration of war. In September of 1950, UN forces, which consisted of the United States and their allies to the United Nations, they executed an amphibious landing at Incheon on the western coast of Korea, and the UN commander was Douglas MacArthur of World War II fame. The UN forces, they moved very aggressively to the north, essentially cutting off North Korean and Chinese forces to their south, and then they began to push into North Korea almost to the border of China. They moved very quickly. That was MacArthur's planned strategy. And of course, during the Korean War, the Korean Peninsula was devastated by the conflict. Every major city was seriously damaged, and there were large-scale civilian casualties in the conflict as well. Casualties that were taken by both sides in the conflict. I want to unpack the Korean War a little bit more. So, initially pushed back, South Korean and U.S. and eventually UN troops will counterattack, and they will gain the upper hand on the Korean Peninsula. They will push back through South Korea, and they will cross the 38th parallel into North Korea, capturing most of the north, basically to the Chinese border. And they're going to accomplish this by late fall of 1950, so very quickly after MacArthur's arrival with reinforcements at Incheon on the west coast of Korea. Remember, the Republic of Korea, the South Korean forces, they were confined to the eastern coast at Pusan. And after capturing most of the peninsula, MacArthur wanted to continue the advance by striking China and even striking Russia possibly as well, to keep the Chinese and the Russians from supporting North Korea, because Chinese manpower support and Russian advisors and material support had played an essential role in the North Korean invasion of the South. He later advocated for the use of nuclear weapons as well against targets in Asia, which Russia had nuclear weapons by 1949. This could have escalated the Cold War into a nuclear conflict. So MacArthur was promoting the escalation of the Korean War. He was also, in his advance against the North Koreans, they advanced very quickly, and critics of MacArthur have suggested that he did not consolidate his territorial gains effectively, and had stretched UN forces too thin, which in many ways was true, because communist forces, they will counterattack in the winter of 1950 and 1951, and they will push UN forces south, actually back over the 38th parallel. UN forces will then fight back again. They'll counterattack the counterattack, and the fighting will kind of stabilize along the 38th parallel, where it's going to largely remain for the rest of the war. And MacArthur was going to be removed from command by President Truman in April of 1951. Officially, this was because the general and the president had disagreements about the grand strategy of the conflict in Korea, but the real reasons were MacArthur was promoting a strategy that was too aggressive. It could lead to escalation of the fighting of the Cold War, possibly causing a hot war, a nuclear war, and for being insubordinate as well. When the president rejected MacArthur's plans, he basically became insubordinate and went around the president, addressing Congress and even the American people, promoting his more aggressive strategy. Some have suggested that MacArthur's known political leanings may have played a role in his dismissal as well. President Truman was a Democrat, and MacArthur was a Republican, and had been very critical of a lot of the domestic programs of the New Deal and of FDR, and in some ways that made him critical of what Truman was doing with the Fair Deal as well. Although if he was dismissed for political reasons, that would have been a problem, actually, because removing him from his military post would have just opened him up for a presidential run, which is exactly what MacArthur had done. He'd run for president in early campaign in the primaries in 1948. He did the same thing in 1952. So really, it wasn't political partisanship. It was insubordination and disagreements about grand strategy. And years later, Truman, when he was no longer president and could speak a bit more freely, he commented on MacArthur's firing. And he said, I didn't remove MacArthur from command because he was a dumb SOB, except he didn't say SOB. He said he removed MacArthur because he was insubordinate. Then Truman said, it's not a crime being a dumb SOB. 3/4 of our generals were dumb SOBs. So really it was insubordination and disagreements over strategy. And Truman replaced MacArthur with Matthew Ridgway, another very well-known World War II general. And the fighting of the Korean War, particularly after 1951, in some ways it was a lot like World War I, where the front did not move very much. Victories and defeats were in very small losses of territory in terms of losses of fortifications, losses of hills. There were some larger coordinated battles, like the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, for example, Chosin. But it's not a war with really large, decisive battles like you see in World War II or earlier wars in which America was involved in. Also, the Korean War does bear some similarities to later conflicts like the Vietnam War as well. And an armistice is going to be proposed in July of 1953. This is actually during the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was sending additional supplies and reinforcements to the Korean Peninsula to force an end to the war, as were communist forces, particularly the Chinese, were sending additional troops to the region as well. But thankfully, an armistice was reached, and technically the war did not end. The Korean War did not end with the armistice, but the major fighting ended in 1953. And the current borders of North and South Korea were established at the 38th parallel. And North and South Korea remain two independent nations that are very adversarial with each other. They're technically at war, although in recent years there have been some movements towards more peaceful relations between the North and the South. And the two nations developed very differently. The South adopted a capitalist economy and eventually became a democratic country and really an economic powerhouse in Asia, a lot like Japan. And the North remained as a dictatorship, a hereditary dictatorship with a communist government and much more behind economically compared to the South or compared to other non-communist Asian nations. In the end, about 33,000 Americans died in the Korean War out of about 3 million total casualties. Although statisticians debate the number of civilian casualties, there's evidence of violence against civilians committed by all sides during the war. And in many cases, North Korean forces simply kidnapped and essentially, you could say, made large amounts of the South Korean population disappear by moving them into forced labor camps and things like that. And violence against civilians was also something that took place because the South Korean forces were fighting a counterinsurgency even before the war began in 1950. So during the Korean War, American policymakers were concerned that this conflict could escalate into a full nuclear war. As I said, there were reasons why General MacArthur's plan to invade China and possibly use nuclear weapons were rejected and why he was removed from command. The U.S. was the first nation to develop working nuclear weapons using, fission-based atomic bombs that use uranium and plutonium that split the atom and create explosions. The Soviets are going to develop their own atomic bombs by 1949, thanks in part to plans that were provided to them by spies that were operating in the United States. Both the Soviets and the United States will continue experimenting, and they're eventually going to develop fusion-based hydrogen bombs. Hydrogen bombs, or H-bombs, they basically work like the sun. They fuse hydrogen into helium, and it creates a much more powerful explosion. You also have something called thermonuclear bombs, which are a combination of fission that starts the explosion, and then fusion, which really makes it big. And these H-bombs, they are hundreds or thousands of times more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The U.S. will detonate its first H-bomb in 1952, and the Soviets will detonate their first H-bomb in 1953. And the Soviet adoption of nuclear bombs, it changes the nature of the Cold War and really of warfare itself. It assured that the United States and its allies would not directly fight against the Soviet Union and its allies because both sides now have the technology to really devastate each other and after a certain point to really completely destroy each other. This belief that the Cold War would never escalate so long as both the First World and the Second World had an equal number of nuclear weapons was called mutually assured destruction. The term First World is a reference to the United States and its allies like Great Britain, West Germany, Italy, France. Our alliance with France is a bit more complicated, but they're considered to be a part of the First World. And the Second World are the communist countries like the Soviet Union, the CCP, Communist China, the People's Republic of China. Eventually, of course, China and the Soviet Union actually kind of become adversaries, even though they're both communist. But the Second World, the communist countries, the First World are the capitalist, what are called liberal democratic countries. In the Third World, which often is a term used for developing countries, poorer countries. Really, it meant countries that were newly independent, usually newly independent from former colonial powers, and they were developing countries, but they were kind of both being enticed to join either the First World or the Second World, either to join as a capitalist, liberal, democratic country or as a communist country. That's where we get the term First World, Second World, and Third World from. Third World really is not meant to be a pejorative or an insulting term for developing countries, but it's kind of become that in recent years. But the final piece of the puzzle to make mutually assured destruction possible, beyond just both the U.S. and their allies and the Soviets and their allies having a large nuclear arsenal, are delivery systems. It's not just aircraft that are needed to have mutually assured destruction. It's intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. And these ICBMs, they are going to be developed by the late 1950s. So the Cold War escalates with the Soviets getting atomic weapons. It escalates further with H-bombs being developed, and mutually assured destruction really begins in the late 50s once ICBMs have been made. This is a collage of images related to Soviet nuclear armament. On the left-hand side is RDS-1 or Joe-1 from 1949, the first Soviet atomic bomb. You can see what it looked like before and after it was detonated. And then on the bottom right-hand side is RDS-37 from 1955, and this is a much larger thermonuclear two-stage bomb. It's a fission bomb to start things off, and then a much larger fusion bomb. So you can see how now the U.S. and the Soviets have nuclear weapons, and the newer nuclear weapons are thousands of times more powerful. And then by the end of the 1950s, these bombs are being launched from intercontinental ballistic missiles. So you can see how mutually assured destruction develops. Really, the fear that comes along with these weapons. And as I mentioned before, there was significant communist espionage activity in the United States. They had spies in the United States. We had spies in the Soviet Union. And communist spies played a major role in delivering the information the Soviets needed to get nuclear bombs. There was one scientist named Klaus Fuchs, Fuchs, that delivered a lot of information. And there's others that passed secrets on to the Soviets as well, including the Rosenbergs. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were a Jewish-American couple. Julius Rosenberg was in the military during World War II and was in a position where he was able to access clandestine information and things of that nature. And we believe that at least Julius Rosenberg was passing information along to the Soviets. We don't know for sure if he understood what he was passing along, and his wife Ethel certainly knew what was going on, but how involved she was in the passing of this information is debatable. But they were arrested and put on trial for espionage and eventually executed. This was a treasonous offense, although there is debate about whether that was a fair sentence, because there's debate about whether they knew what information they were passing along. Certainly they would have known it was secret, but did they know how important this information was? And some have also suggested too that there was ethnic prejudice against this couple because they were Jewish, and that there were holes in the testimony. One of their primary accusers was a guy named David Greenglass, who was actually Ethel Rosenberg's brother, and people say there are irregularities with the testimony. I think it's actually a lot like the Sacco and Vanzetti case, where Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian men with radical politics. The Rosenbergs were Jewish people with radical politics, and I think it's very likely that they were in fact guilty, that they had engaged in espionage. But certainly ethnic prejudice and political prejudice did play a role in their trial and in their ultimate convictions. And during this period in the United States, you have politicians as well as government employees that are operating against spies and against agents for the Soviet Union in the United States. You have FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and he was director of the FBI for 48 years, from 1924 to 1972. Revolutionized the organization, modernized the organization, made it the FBI that it is today. And he also investigated just a lot of U.S. citizens, including people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And essentially, Hoover gathered a lot of information, what you might call dirt, on Americans. We think even on American politicians as well, which is partially why he was able to remain director of the FBI for so long. Nobody wanted to cross him. And then on the far right is Senator Joseph McCarthy, who oversaw the McCarthy hearings in the Senate. McCarthy had been formerly a Democratic politician from Wisconsin, but he'd become a Republican, and he was known for having a conservative and I would say to some degree populistic beliefs. He liked to be called Tail Gun Joe because he'd been a tail gunner in a bomber aircraft in World War II. But he's going to oversee the most famous series of hearings related to alleged communist subversion in the United States. Here are some important points about the McCarthy hearings and what is often called the era of McCarthyism. And this is happening from about 1950 to about 1954. In 1954, the American public had really begun to turn on McCarthy. They'd begun to view his hearings as excessive, And in some ways, McCarthy had also gone way too far in his accusations as well, which I'll get to in a moment. So to begin, there were spies and there were communist sympathizers in the United States, even in the U.S. government. There's ample evidence of this. This was known during the period we're talking about, and a lot of this was confirmed in the 1990s when the Soviet Union fell and Soviet Politburo archives were opened. The problem with McCarthyism was that Senator McCarthy would make accusations without sufficient evidence, with the hope that the people he accused would become afraid and they would admit to being communists and they would basically become informants. They would expose other people. And these accusations, again, they often were on spurious evidence or no real evidence at all. And some would say that evidence was manufactured. McCarthy would come into the hearing and he would say, on this piece of paper, I have a list of 100 names of communist agents in the U.S. Army, for example. And was this list of names real? In many cases, it wasn't, but he was trying to scare and intimidate people into admitting they were communists and becoming informants. And these accusations were often politically motivated as well. McCarthy had been a Democrat who'd become a Republican. In some cases, the people that he's sparring with, particularly towards the end of the hearings, are his Democratic opponents. And Americans from a variety of backgrounds are eventually going to come out against McCarthy. They're going to see his tactics as antithetical to American values, that the constitutional rights of the accused are being violated because they're not being confronted with real evidence, and there's an attempt to intimidate them into admitting to being communist. And McCarthy even, as I said, went too far. He accused President Dwight Eisenhower of being too soft on communism. And of course, Eisenhower had won the 1952 election, and he was a popular American president. And in 1954, in one hearing in 1954, McCarthy was investigating a young man named Fred Fisher for having communist ties as a young man, as many young people often do. And he was being defended by an associate of his named Joseph Welch. And Welch said to McCarthy, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" Criticizing this young man for his political leanings from decades ago and using this as evidence that he's a communist agent. And this interaction in particular really led to public opinion really tanking against McCarthy. And ultimately, he's going to be censured by the Senate. And essentially after this, McCarthy's reputation was moribund, and then he was actually going to die 3 years later of problems or complications related to alcoholism. But at about the same time in American history, you also have the Lavender Scare. So you have McCarthyism, the really famous Red Scare that everybody thinks about when they think about the Red Scares in America. As I've said, there's been many Red Scares in America, but the Lavender Scare took place on the backdrop of fear of communist subversion in the United States. During the 1930s, during the Great Depression, many young LGBT people, particularly gay men, and some lesbian women, they left their small towns. They left the economic blight they were seeing in many parts of rural America. And they took jobs with the U.S. government, particularly in Washington, D.C. And while they were in these government jobs, they met other young LGBT people and in some cases struck up relationships. They went to secret gay bars and things of this nature. And this stuff was very, very taboo and very secretive. They were certainly not out of the closet in our modern language. but it was believed that there were a disproportionate number of LGBT people in the U.S. government, and that didn't sit very well with the Eisenhower administration. There was concern that these people could be blackmailed and basically be manipulated by communist spies and communist agents. So during the Eisenhower administration, you're going to see the mass dismissal, the mass firing of gay and lesbian employees from the U.S. government. Even leading government officials are going to be accused of homosexuality. People like Roy Cohn and J. Edgar Hoover. Of course, there is good evidence of J. Edgar being involved in homosexual acts, and in some cases, acts with males that are underaged, which we certainly would not condone at all today, even if our ideas about homosexuality and LGBT issues have changed. But Eisenhower oversaw the removal of LGBT government employees. During the Truman administration as well, government employees also had to take loyalty oaths to the United States as well. So you would argue that in the Cold War, via Truman's loyalty oaths, via McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and then via the Lavender Scare, you're seeing in some cases a pressure to conform and constraints being put on freedom of expression and freedom of conscience. Even though America is the land of the free, the home of the brave, we have the Constitution, we have the First Amendment, we are constraining those rights in the name of fighting the Cold War and protecting our country from communist subversion, which in some ways is the irony of the Cold War. How can a free country do these things? But that's something I'll leave for the viewer, to decide. 1952 was an election year in the United States, and in this election, Dwight Eisenhower, former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, will run for president for the Republicans, and he's going to run against Adlai Stevenson II for the Democrats. Eisenhower had no previous political experience, but he would have been well known to Americans from World War II, from being seen in newsreels during the conflict. He would have been a household name. Stevenson, although he had political experience, formerly being the governor of Illinois, he would actually in some ways would have been less well known to the average American. And in this election, in some ways, Stevenson and the Democrats, voting for them was a vote to continue the policies of FDR and of Harry Truman and of the status quo. The economy, though, was in some ways struggling in the 1950s. On the whole, this is a period of a good economy with good GDP growth, but there were problems with inflation and particularly with higher meat prices. They actually used to call Harry Truman horse meat Harry because people were having to eat cheaper, worse cuts of meat because of higher meat prices. Also, the Korean War was continuing on. One of Eisenhower's promises as a president, or as a presidential candidate, was to end the conflict in Korea. So Eisenhower was the candidate of change. Stevenson was the candidate of continuing the status quo. And you can even see this in how they did their campaigns. Eisenhower, in part because he had less political experience, he opted for really a more cutting-edge campaign, particularly using the new media of television. Television technology has been around for a couple of decades, but more and more Americans are buying TV sets during this period. By the early 1960s, the majority of American households will have TVs. So to not use television would be a significant mistake. So the Eisenhower campaign, they ran what were basically the first television campaign ads in American history. They were called the Eisenhower Answers America campaign ads. Basically, you would have prospective voters asking Eisenhower a question, and Eisenhower would answer. And this worked really well because Eisenhower was uncomfortable making long speeches. He was a military man who could be very inspiring and could make very quick and pithy remarks, but was not someone who was inclined to give long speeches the way traditional politicians would. So television was a great media format for the Eisenhower campaign. They also had the Ike for President campaign jingle cartoon. I like Ike, you like Ike, everybody loves Ike, and that's why his campaign slogan was "I like Ike." So he made a much better use of technology, and across time, presidential candidates that make a better use of technology in their campaigns are more likely to win. Stevenson was dismissive of television as a media for presidential candidates to address the people and to do things that were serious. Stevenson, who was known for his witty comments and things like that, he said, this is a campaign of Eisenhower versus Stevenson. It's not palm olive versus ivory, referencing, commercials. The television was for commercials and for soap operas, not for serious things like presidential elections. This was a major mistake by the Stevenson campaign and by Stevenson himself. They did eventually get onto the television, but they put on long speeches that the average American didn't want to watch. They even tried to have their own campaign song. It was called "I Love the Gov," but really it was what we would call today cringy. Gov sounds like you're saying you love the government, and that's just not a popular sentiment in 1952. People are looking for a change. In the Stevenson campaign, they tried to characterize Eisenhower as unfit to be president, as inexperienced, as not intelligent enough, not up to snuff to be president, which of course he had plenty of military experience that would be very relevant to being president. Eisenhower was very hardworking. They used to say that he would smoke 5 packs of cigarettes a day and drink like 25 cups of coffee a day because he was that focused and trying to be that industrious. And of course, Eisenhower was very intelligent. He'd been to West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, which is not an easy school to get into, and it's not easy curriculum either once you're there. So Eisenhower was more than qualified. And the American people recognized this, and they voted for Eisenhower commandingly in the popular vote. And then he won the Electoral College in a landslide, basically taking the entire northern United States and even some southern states like Florida and Texas and Tennessee and Virginia. And then again in 1956, the Democrats will run Stevenson a second time against Eisenhower, and Eisenhower will beat him a second time by an even greater margin. Sadly for Adley is what people used to say, a man who was just not meant to be president. So how would we describe Eisenhower's politics and his political agenda? Because he was not a career politician. He came into politics in the Republican Party later in life. Well, Eisenhower could best be described as a progressive conservative. He even used very similar language to talk about what he was trying to do politically. He said, I am liberal with people and conservative with money. And you see this in that he was trying to help people, give Americans a hand up, but he wanted to do so in a way that was going to be economically sustainable and that would work for the future. Sometimes this is called dynamic conservatism. It's moving away from the limited government, low tax, very pro-business, deregulatory systems of conservatism that were popular in the 1920s, which arguably, you might say, helped to cause the Great Depression, towards a form of conservatism that allows for more social safety nets and more government regulations to help and protect Americans, but that is very culturally conservative. Remember, the 1920s was a period of, you might say, social and cultural liberalism. Live how you want, do what you want by the standards of the period, but then a very limited government, low taxes, pro-business kind of climate. That's not really what Eisenhower's 1950s conservatism was. It's sort of the opposite. It's more culturally conservative, but then in terms of government and social systems, a bit more on the liberal side. And to highlight Eisenhower's progressive conservatism, you can see this in how he handled the emerging civil rights movement, sending the U.S. military in to enforce civil rights legislation in Arkansas, as you can see on the left-hand image of this slide, and also in things like the deportations that take place in 1954. Those are called Operation WETBACK. If I say that word on YouTube, this video will be taken down. While some would argue that these deportations were enabled by racial prejudice and profiling, others would say that removing people in the country illegally will lead to higher wages for U.S. citizens. As we discussed, the Eisenhower administration and his progressive conservative approach to politics, often known as dynamic conservatism, we should discuss Brown versus Board of Education and the beginnings of the post-World War II civil rights movement. African Americans, as you know, have fought for civil rights and legal equality for many decades before the 1950s, but the civil rights movement gained significant tailwinds and significant support during and after the Second World War. The support that African Americans gave to the country during the war and desegregationist policies that were enacted during the war fueled the fire of civil rights. And African Americans recognized this with the Double V campaign: victory abroad against fascism and totalitarianism, victory at home against racism and for freedom and equality. And during the Cold War, African American civil rights took on a new sense of urgency as well. It became a national security issue. African Americans and white Americans recognized that segregation and the Jim Crow laws were inconsistent with the American values of freedom and democracy. We were fighting against a totalitarian state that denied its people civil rights, and so we ought to not be doing those very same things in the United States. And so I want you to think about this context as we talk about the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case. This case began in Topeka, Kansas, which is actually not in the South, it's in the North. Segregation was in the North as well as the South. And African American students had to walk past a white school to attend their African American school, and that was unfair to the students who had a longer commute to school when there was a perfectly fine white school that was closer to their community. So these families sued, and their case went to the Supreme Court, where it was decided 9-0 that separate but equal language that had been the law of the land since the 1890s in the Plessy v. Ferguson case. This was unconstitutional, and it violated the 14th Amendment. It violated the 14th Amendment's equal protection under the law clause. Basically, they argued that because segregation, there was no practical separate but equal. Almost universally, African American accommodations, whether they were schools or train cars or water fountains, were not as good as the facilities provided to white people, and therefore segregation was innately unequal and thus a violation of the 14th Amendment. In the footnotes, the justices also cited psychological studies that suggest that black children being made to go to segregated schools, that was something that made them inferior or made them feel inferior. They were certainly not inferior. And this case was interpreted very broadly. It's not only going to apply to public schools, but to public transportation. You're going to see this in the Montgomery bus boycotts and other bus boycotts, and even in privately owned public spaces like the Woolworth lunch counters that are going to be desegregated after protests in the early 1960s. And the data we have suggests that most Americans celebrate this decision as being in line with American notions of equality and liberty, but white Southerners will aggressively oppose the Brown versus Board decision. In fact, white Southern leaders, including Strom Thurmond, who I mentioned before, they're going to draft a document called the Southern Manifesto, in which they condemn desegregation and advocate for the Jim Crow system. And the image on this slide is secondarily related to Brown versus Board. It's related to desegregation. It is of second baseman for the Brooklyn Dodgers, Jackie Robinson. He will challenge segregation in baseball from 1947 to 1956. Before Robinson's career, African Americans played in separate black leagues. They weren't called black leagues, but Robinson's talent as an athlete helped to bring about desegregation of the sport of baseball, of the MLB. And there were other black baseball players that played a role too, but Robinson is generally regarded as being the most significant of these trailblazing African American athletes. The Brown versus Board case was in 1954. A year later, in 1955, there was an event called the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young African American teenager who was murdered by several men, several white men in Mississippi, allegedly after he had had an interaction with a white woman. Supposedly he had possibly flirted with her, although we don't really know for sure. The woman in question changed her story multiple times and is not really a credible source of testimony. But the interaction took place in a grocery store called the Bryant grocery store. The woman in question, her name was Carolyn Bryant. You can see the remains of the grocery store in the center image of the slide, and there's a commemorative marker there in the state of Mississippi to note what happened there. But this event is also going to jumpstart the civil rights movement in the 1950s just as much as the Brown versus Board of Education case will. I'll unpack the Till case a little bit more. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American teenager. He was from Chicago. He was visiting his family in the Delta region of Mississippi, and he was murdered in 1955 after a interaction with a white woman named Carolyn Bryant at a local grocery store that her family ran. The exact details of what happened between the two of them are debated, and the woman in question changed her account several times, and eventually said, "I don't really remember what was said that day." Supposedly, young Emmett Till may have flirted with her. He may have been just trying to get her attention to get help with one of the items in the grocery store. We don't really know for sure. But whatever happened, Till had apparently violated the Jim Crow, racial caste system, which kept black people and white people separate, but in an unequal situation. Particularly kept black males and white females separate. And Carolyn Bryant's husband and family and others, they went out at night, and they found Emmett Till. They kidnapped him, and then they basically beat him and tortured him to death. And then they threw his body into a river. It was actually attached to parts of a cotton gin to cause it to sink. His mutilated and decomposed corpse was found 3 days later. Till's mother, Mamie Till, insisted their son's funeral be held in public and in technically it was a glass casket. That way the nation can see the horrible things that had happened to her son. And the murder of Emmett Till caused national outrage, with African American leaders from the NAACP condemning the murder and calling for the arrest and trial of the Bryant brothers and others that were involved. We believe that it was actually probably several men beyond just the Bryant brothers who took part in this kidnapping and torture and murder. And Till's murder shocked Americans from a variety of backgrounds and identities. And the trial took place actually in a different part of Mississippi. The defendants, they were not known by the local community, but they stood before an all-white jury, which was generally the norm in the South in this period. And the all-white jury elected to acquit the Bryant brothers for the murder of Emmett Till. And there's a couple of things to note. This case is very controversial. People in more recent years have talked about the changes that Carolyn Bryant made to her story. They've talked about how the state of Mississippi actually eventually put out an arrest warrant for Carolyn Bryant for possibly for making false statements, for committing perjury during the trial. There's also been discussion of Emmett Till's family, particularly that his father, who was in the Second World War, he actually was executed for sexual assault in Italy. during World War II. Others will point out how the Bryant brothers they played to the patriotism of everyday Americans by wearing their Korean War uniforms to their trial, and they were, of course, acquitted. And then they actually basically confessed to the murder to Look magazine, a very popular magazine during the period. But because of double jeopardy laws in America, you can't be tried again for the same offense, and so they basically got away with it. But at the end of the day, Till's death shocked the American people. Americans from a variety of backgrounds, and Till's death is going to inspire a new generation of African American activists, including people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., who are going to begin their activism in 1956 and 1957. So now we'll discuss the Montgomery bus boycott, which built on the Brown versus Board Supreme Court case, which ended segregation, and the murder of Emmett Till also was an accelerant for the civil rights movement. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks, a middle-aged African-American woman who worked as a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a public bus in the city. Montgomery's buses were segregated with black and white sections, and if there were more white riders, black people would have to move further to the back of the bus and give up their seats. And if the white section was full, they would be forced to stand in some cases. Parks, in defiance of the Jim Crow laws, refused to give up her seat and was arrested. Other African Americans had attempted to boycott or start protests of the segregated buses, including a young woman named Claudette Colvin. Although Colvin did not have as good of a reputation as Parks did, there were allegations that she engaged in prostitution or sex work. But Parks, being older, having a good job as a seamstress, she was the kind of person you would want to lead your boycott because of her much more positive reputation. After her arrest, there was a mass boycott of public transportation in Montgomery. African Americans, they stopped riding the buses, they walked to work, they went in carpools. In some cases, white Americans helped with these boycotts by acting as carpool drivers or just by not using the buses themselves. And the protests ended up costing the city of Montgomery a significant amount of money, and it paved the way for desegregation of public spaces in southern states. Parks' protests will also inspire the Freedom Riders of 1961, who are going to call for the desegregation of interstate buses like Greyhound. Because what would happen is Greyhound buses, when they entered southern states, they would stop the bus, the driver would announce that they have entered a southern state, and black passengers would have to move to the back of the bus. And this was actually often very embarrassing for black people from the North who didn't know how things were in the South, or for African dignitaries that might enter the United States via New York City, and then on a bus ride down to Washington, D.C., they would be told even though they are a foreign dignitary, they have to follow these Jim Crow laws. Again, there's significant intersection between the Cold War and civil rights. But the 1955 to 1956 Montgomery bus boycotts are a success. In 1957, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister from Georgia, from the Atlanta area, who had worked with Parks in the past and had studied nonviolent protests and civil disobedience, tactics used by people like Mahatma Gandhi in India to protest British rule over India. He studied those tactics and wanted to implement them for African American activism in the United States. So he is going to go on to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. He's going to found it with several other African American leaders, including Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was gay as well, and he's actually going to be a important leader in the early gay rights movement as well. Ella Baker helped to found the SCLC. She was a bit more radical than King was, and also was interested in challenging patriarchal gender norms more than King was. King was actually very patriarchal, and she would go on to help found other more radical, more student-focused African American organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission, known as SNCC, which we'll talk about more in a later video, and Stanley Levison, a very wealthy, left-leaning white man, also helped found the SCLC in 1957. So 1954 is Brown versus Board of Education. 1955 is the murder of Emmett Till. 1955 through 1956 is the Montgomery bus boycott, and 1957 is the founding of the SCLC. And one last note on the SCLC and Dr. King. King believed that nonviolent protests would be far more effective in the fight for African American civil rights because peaceful direct action would be more likely to get everyday middle-class white Americans to support the African American cause. And also it's going to get much more positive media attention as well. King understood that perception was very important if you were going to have a successful social movement. In 1957, the same year that the SCLC is founded, you have fallout from the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954. In Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, President Eisenhower actually deployed U.S. Army soldiers from the 101st Airborne to escort 9 black high school students to class at the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. This was done after the governor of Arkansas had mobilized the Arkansas National Guard to keep students out of the school. So now you have federal authority overriding state authority. It's a more liberal cause, integration, but then it's being done through very conservative means, the military, and it's being done for the sake of law and order. And as I mentioned before, Eisenhower supporting law and order. He's supporting the advancement of the civil rights movement, but privately, he actually had some significant reservations about integration. And the students do enter the high school with the protection of the U.S. Army. Very brave thing to do. As they're entering the school, they're going to face harassment and racial epithets from anti-integration protesters, including from other white high school students. Most famous image is of a white student named Hazel Bryan screaming at a black student named Elizabeth Eckford, which you can see on the left-hand side of this slide. It's considered to be one of the most iconic images of the fallout from the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, and really from the entire civil rights era. I also want to talk about President Eisenhower's support of technological developments. There were significant technological and transportation developments during his presidency. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite, the first satellite to orbit the planet. And this was very alarming to Americans. If the Soviets could put satellites into space, what else would they be able to do technologically? Could they spy on the United States? Could they launch missiles into space that would target American cities? There was a lot of fear. I actually interviewed a man who was in U.S. Army basic training in 1957 when Sputnik was launched, and they called everybody out of their barracks. They issued them helmets and rifles and had everybody standing ready in the event of a possible Soviet attack. In response to the Sputnik launch, the United States begins to put more investment into space exploration. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, will be founded in 1958. You'll also see increased funding for colleges and universities, especially for STEM and defense weapon creation. But this increased defense funding and STEM funding is good for all departments at universities. In addition, new universities are founded, especially in places like California. You have UC Davis and UC Riverside were founded during this period. And then UC Santa Cruz and UC Irvine were founded a little bit later in 1965. But the idea is that colleges and universities are playing a part in the Cold War. They're creating military and defense technology. They're training up college graduates who can become scientists, who can become military officers, and veterans can also use the GI Bill to go back to college later in life. President Eisenhower famously said everyone is a soldier. Men, not just men in uniform, but men at home, in college are soldiers, men working on technological developments are soldiers, women are soldiers as they take care of their homes and raise their children, and children are soldiers too by going to school and studying hard. Eisenhower was a big supporter of technological development, as you can see with the founding of NASA, with increased funding for colleges and universities, and also with the interstate highway system, which it was originally the national system of interstate and defense highways. These highways were created so that U.S. military personnel and supplies could be more easily moved across the country. As a young military officer, Eisenhower traveled from the eastern United States to the West Coast, and traveling in these truck convoys wasn't too difficult in the eastern U.S. But once they got to the Rocky Mountains, the roads were insufficient. There were too many hairpin turns, too many switchbacks, and large convoys that are towing things like missiles. It just wasn't going to be practical. So there was a plan to create a national system of 2-lane and 4-lane highways. And of course, these highways were being built because of the Cold War, but they also can be used for commerce, for shipping, and for trucks. And they can be used for everyday American civilians to go on road trips or to commute to work. And some people would suggest that there were other factors at play in constructing the highway system. It wasn't just about defense. It wasn't just about commerce. It was also about bolstering the auto industry and bolstering car infrastructure. Adlai Stevenson, who Eisenhower beat twice for the presidency, famously said, "With the Eisenhower administration, the new dealers have been replaced with car dealers." And there probably is an ounce of truth to that statement in the interstate highway system. We'll talk a bit more about technology in a moment. I've argued that Eisenhower was balanced on social issues, but he was a unilateral supporter of American technological advancement. The interstate highway system, mentioned before, the space race that began in earnest in 1957. You could even include things like the kitchen debate of 1959, in which his vice president, Richard Nixon, debated American capitalism with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. And part of this is the belief that liberal democracy and free market capitalism would yield greater technological advancement than communism and command economies. The American capitalist system, it's not as centrally planned or centrally managed as the Soviet system is, but there's a lot of productivity because there's a lot of free enterprise and profit motivation. So this is a ideological battle as well as being a technological battle. The Cold War is just as ideological as it is military or technological. So the interstate highway system is created so that American troops and supplies can be more easily moved across the United States. This does have benefits for American civilian motorists and for trucking and shipping companies as well. Americans are excited to drive cars now because they'd had to avoid driving for sightseeing and things like that during World War II. They couldn't buy new cars during World War II, but now they can buy these things. And you're supposed to buy these things for the good of the country. And this is a project, the Interstate Highway Project. It's going to appeal to both liberals and conservatives. It's a big government project. It's putting people to work. It's funded by fuel taxes, things that are supported by liberals. But it's built for conservative reasons as well, to bolster the military and bolster commerce, and possibly even to bolster the auto industry as well. But with all technological developments, there is innovation, but there is also disruption. With the interstate highway system comes things like increased sprawl. Suburbs can extend and be less dense. They can extend further beyond the cities because American motorists can commute into work. Environmental degradation, not only from pollution from cars, but also from the creation of these interstate highways. Mountains have to be dynamited, forests have to be cut down, and automobile-centric infrastructure is going to be further prioritized as a result of the infrastructure, the interstate infrastructure system. There's also concerns with the location of these projects. They're often built through poorer, often minority neighborhoods when they're being built in big cities. That is a concern. There's noise, there's pollution that comes from the interstate projects. Granted, having the interstate close to your home also makes it easier to travel and get from point A to point B too. And you really see this in rural areas where the interstate highway system bypasses small towns. Some of these small towns out west, they lose business, and they almost become like old west 19th century ghost towns because nobody's stopping at these towns anymore to buy gasoline or to eat the local diner. They're taking the interstate highway, which has clear exits and entrances. And you also see that older roads and highways, they lose prominence as well. They lose traffic as well. Most notably, Route 66, which was built in the 1920s. It's actually going to be decommissioned as a highway in the 1980s because people are taking interstates instead, which are faster and more convenient. And the last thing I'll mention as well, and this doesn't get covered as much in textbooks, but in some of the more advanced kind of monograph studies of the interstate highway system, you'll see that where the highway is built, its start and its ending point will influence how newer parts of the country are developed. When I say newer, I mean areas with a lower population density that don't have as big of cities where people are moving to. And I would point to Florida, for example, which had a much lower population in the 1950s than now. I-75 runs down the Gulf Coast of Florida. Its northern terminus is in Detroit in the Midwest. I-95, it runs down the Atlantic, the east coast of Florida, and its northern terminus is up in Maine. And so people from the Northeast, they take I-95, they settle on the east coast of Florida. People from the Midwest, they take I-75 down south, and they settle on the Gulf Coast of Florida. And you still see that to some degree today. With air travel, it's a little bit less relevant now. And certainly the state of Florida has changed quite a bit as it's gotten to be more populated. But for many years, there were considerable political and cultural differences between the Atlantic coast of Florida and the Gulf Coast of Florida because of where I-75 started and where I-95 started. So the way the interstate highway system is built also influences how the United States is going to be built out in the 20th century. So far, we've primarily talked about President Eisenhower's domestic policy, his response to the civil rights movement, his advocacy for science and technology. We have to talk about his foreign policy as well. Eisenhower was a Cold Warrior, and the Cold War does intensify during his presidency, not just because of things like bigger, more powerful nuclear bombs, but Eisenhower's approach to the Cold War was more aggressive than Truman's. While Eisenhower did run on getting America out of the Cold War, and that was something that did happen, America did get out of the Cold War in 1953. In other areas, the United States is actually going to become more aggressive militarily during the Eisenhower presidency. Eisenhower was a believer in what was called domino theory, that if one nation in a region fell to communism, then other nations would fall to communism. And eventually, even the United States could fall to communism, like a set of dominoes. And so you're going to see Eisenhower is going to support military interventions in places like Vietnam, and as well as more clandestine operations in places like Guatemala and Iran. I mentioned this first point, so I won't go over it a second time, but I will discuss the second point here. There was a CIA-backed coup in Guatemala in 1954. It was overseen by the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles, director of the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State. They were concerned that the United Fruit Company, a company that grew bananas, was going to lose its land holdings in Guatemala. They were going to be nationalized by the left-wing Jacobo Arbenz government. Arbenz was left-wing, and while he was not specifically a communist, we do believe that there were communist participants in his government, most notably a young Argentinian man named Ernesto or Che Guevara. This operation also, I should add, although it was executed under the Eisenhower presidency, they'd been planning it since the Truman administration as well. So the CIA was assisting in this coup against the Arbenz government to protect the United Fruit Company's land holdings, which were going to be, as I said, nationalized by Arbenz. And they were looking for any kind of ties between communist states and Guatemala. The only really credible tie they found were arms shipments from communist Czechoslovakia to Guatemala. but direct connections to the USSR were never actually confirmed. So basically, the CIA helped a private company topple a democratically elected but left-wing government in Guatemala. Basically, this was done for business reasons, although it was officially sold as being a anti-communist maneuver. A little bit further to the east in the Caribbean Sea, the United States is going to support the administration or the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista during the Cuban Revolution of 1953 to 1959. Batista may have been a dictator, but he was an anti-communist. As time went on, though, the United States actually stopped supporting Batista. They began to blockade Cuba. They will actually begin supporting Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries after 1957. There were news reports done by Herbert Matthews of the New York Times about Castro that were very, you could say, fawning reports about Castro the freedom fighter, that Castro was not truly a communist, he really just supported democracy, and that he is the person that we should be backing in this fight. And actually, that's exactly what happens. The U.S. will essentially switch sides and will help Fidel Castro gain power in Cuba. And once Castro got into power, he did not hold free elections. He said that the political parties of Cuba were too corrupt. And he said he was going to nationalize all American property in Cuba, down to the nails in their shoes, is what Castro promised. In Asia in 1953, the U.S. and the British are going to oversee a coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected but left-wing leader of Iran. Mossadegh planned to nationalize British oil holdings. This was called Operation Ajax, the removal of Mossadegh from power. There was also concerns that Mossadegh might be getting too friendly with the Soviets, that there might be communist infiltrators in his government as well, but as Mossadegh is removed from power, he's going to be replaced with the Shah of Iran, who will be loyal to the United States. And we'll talk about the Iranian Revolution that happens in the 1970s in a future video. And in East Asia, France was losing its holdings in Indochina, what we now know as Vietnam, as well as the countries of Laos and Cambodia. Eisenhower did not help the French maintain control of Indochina. France withdrew from Indochina in 1954, and under the Geneva Accords, Indochina, or Vietnam specifically, was divided into a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. North Vietnam would be communist, the South Vietnam would be non-communist, and there would be an eventual reunification of the country after free elections. In 1955, the United States will send elite advisor troops to South Vietnam. He's only going to send a small contingent, just over 1,000 troops that are there to train and give advice to the South Vietnamese military. They're officially not there for combat operations, but there's evidence that these advisors did, in some cases, engage in combat. In addition, Eisenhower also condemned when Britain and France seized the Suez Canal with the help of Israel in 1956. So the Eisenhower administration, it was anti-communist. It did support coups for business reasons that were basically defended as being anti-communism, but he also actually was anti-colonialist as well. He did not help France maintain control of their colonies in Southeast Asia. He did not back the British and the French when they tried to retake the Suez Canal in Egypt in 1956. One last note on foreign policy. 2025 JFK files have revealed that the 1956 failed revolution or coup against the communist government of Hungary was CIA sponsored, and that coup was very brutally suppressed by the communist Hungarian government and with considerable Soviet support. I want to begin to wrap up the Eisenhower administration now. In his farewell address, Eisenhower gave this very famous warning: in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. As president and as a former military officer, Eisenhower understood how powerful weapons manufacturers and defense industries could be and how influential they could be, funding presidential campaigns, using advertising and marketing to target the American people. And this is something he warned the American people against in his farewell address. And we do believe that Eisenhower himself, this was not his speechwriters having him say this. This was something that he wanted to say himself. But he's at the end of his presidency. He can speak more plainly and more frankly, and so he warns the American people against the military-industrial complex, which was definitely growing in the 1950s as a result of the Cold War. And I'll leave the viewers to decide how well America has heeded Eisenhower's warning. With the time we have left in this lecture, we're going to discuss more of daily life in Cold War America from the mid-40s through the early 60s. And this period is often referred to as the affluent society because while the economy wasn't perfect, there was issues with inflation, for example. There had been strikes after World War II. On the whole, it was a period of economic prosperity. And this is where we have John Kenneth Galbraith's affluent society. He was an economist who was influential in the FDR, Truman, JFK, and eventually LBJ administrations. He authored several books, the most famous of which was the 1958 Affluent Society. And the main argument of the book is that America's increasing GDP during this period was not necessarily a sign of increasing well-being for a population. I think GDP is generally a good thing, but it doesn't always tell the whole story. I do agree with Galbraith on that. And Galbraith points to the fact that the private sector was growing faster than the public sector. There's more jobs in private industry relative to jobs in the public sector, and he argues that this is going to lead to social strife and wealth disparities. And he also would argue that mid-century American consumer culture was driven more by marketing and advertising than actual human needs, and that this demand for consumer goods and for housing and for automobiles was more a product of mass media marketing and advertisement than it was of actual human desire and agency. And there is some truth to this. Marketing is very powerful. We saw this with Edward Bernays back in the 1920s. We saw it even with the marketing campaigns that defended the CIA and United Fruit Company coup in Guatemala. But again, marketing is not going to work if there's not a human desire for that product to begin with. Marketing will just make you aware of the product and will make you more interested in purchasing it. And as I've emphasized throughout this video, the fighting of the Cold War, both abroad in these proxy conflicts and at home, with defense spending, with the development of NASA, these things also have an impact on the American home front and on American culture, and they're going to really help to create the modern American middle class, the hallmarks of middle class American life that we think of today. Suburbanization, owning automobiles, purchasing consumer goods, being able to go on vacation throughout the year, things of that nature. During this period, everyday Americans are encouraged by their government to fight communism by embracing capitalism and embracing and buying into American consumer culture. You're proving that capitalism offers a higher standard of living than communism, that it offers not only more freedom, but more choice as well when it comes to products, when it comes to housing, when it comes to automobiles. And many Americans had been told to sacrifice. Some of them said they had no choice but to sacrifice during the Depression and World War II. They'd been saving their money during the war, and now they're supposed to do things differently. They're supposed to spend money and buy consumer goods. The patriotic thing now is to buy and to engage in this economy through consumption. So the American economy is also retooling in this period. It's manufacturing and industry are still important, but our economy is increasingly going to be driven by consumption. And so during the Cold War, Americans will buy new cars, new homes, they'll adopt new clothing styles thanks to the economic prosperity of the period, and it's the patriotic thing to do as well. That might sound odd, but that was how Americans at the time viewed this consumer culture. You see this Eisenhower, everyone's a soldier mentality, buy consumer goods, live a middle-class life in order to fight communism. You see this in many aspects of mid-century American culture. You see this with the growth of automobile suburbs, mass suburbanization. This is the Levy family in Levittown, New York. These were some early suburban homes that were built in the late 1940s. You see it with the Walker GI Bill, which encouraged American veterans to attend college for free in exchange for their military service, or go into business or take a job at a factory producing consumer goods. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, not all elements of the GI Bill were as available to African American veterans. And the GI Bill is part of a longer arc or bend in American history of increasing college attendance and increasing college education. And really the idea that college education is a prerequisite for being in the middle class. Some of these ideas are being questioned now in the 2020s as college has gotten to be so expensive, and people question the utility of these degrees with internet and AI and things of that nature. But to begin, I'll say to strengthen the American middle class, particularly the white-collar middle class, returning veterans are offered the Walker GI Bill. It was passed back in 1944. You pursue higher education, it's covered by your military service, although African Americans were often denied the benefits of these acts, since disbursement of GI Bill funds was handled by local, usually white committees, and many colleges did not allow black people to attend. So there's fewer places that a black person could use their GI Bill benefits if they even got them. About 49% of returning veterans will use the GI Bill to go to college. There's a desire to go to college, to get a good white-collar management job, and to enter what is called the technocracy, and to become, in the language of the day, one of the men in the gray flannel suits. Have a nice suit, have a white-collar job, support your family on a single income. That's what Americans were trying to do in this period. And the GI Bill, it's significant because it makes higher education, which had previously been dominated by the elite. It had become somewhat more available to middle class people, but now it's available to people of all economic classes. If you are a veteran, even if you come from a working class background, even if you're the first in your family to go to college, you can go to college now. And it's going to pave the way for large-scale university attendance amongst middle class Americans or people who are aspiring to become middle class, who want upward social mobility. So why does the government continue the GI Bill even to this day? Well, they wanted to thank veterans for their service, both in the past and in the present, and a well-educated populace, they reasoned back in the Cold War years, would be better prepared to fight the Cold War. They would have better job training, they would have better scientific knowledge, they could develop new technologies, they could be better military officers, better managers, and also there's the belief that well-educated people are less likely to fall for the what you might call the snake oil of communism. Is that always true, that well-educated people are not communists? In many cases, that's not true. But there was that belief at the time. And so I would connect the Walker GI Bill, increased funding for universities, the setting up of new universities. I would connect it to things like the Morrill Act back in the 1860s through 1890s, which set up land-grant universities. Again, there's an arc of increasing college attendance in American history that really has held true until about the 2010s when college enrollment began to decline. And the GI Bill also included benefits for home ownership as well. VA home loans would allow a returning veteran to purchase a home with zero down and on a 20-year mortgage. Americans in general were encouraged to buy real estate during the Cold War, and home ownership was something that was also very important in the Great Depression as well, help Americans build wealth and gain assets. And here are some images of early suburbs. You have Levittown, built by Bill Levitt. The first Levittown was in Long Island, New York. Later, Levittowns will be built in places like Pennsylvania, and even in places like Florida and even Puerto Rico, a territory of the United States. And some of these communities specifically did not allow African Americans to purchase homes, continuing earlier policies in a manner very similar to FHA redlining. But in selling suburban homes, you're not just selling a house, you're selling an experience. You, your spouse, your children, father drives to the city for work. He works his 40 hours a week. He wears his nice gray suit to go to work. His wife stays at home. She sends the kids off to school, and she cleans the house, and she cooks meals for them. The father does work outside of the home, lawn mowing, painting, home maintenance, as you can see in the image on the right-hand slide, and his wife handles work inside the home and will cook for the family and do homemaking for the family, all while being dressed very nicely as well. There was a lot of effort into dressing professionally in the Cold War period to show that you're engaging in the capitalist consumer economy. And also, it's part of that Eisenhower-esque everyone's a soldier mentality. Soldiers have to wear nice uniforms. They have to have everything perfectly ironed and fitting properly. The same thing goes for American civilians. Men have to wear good, well-fitting suits. Women wear, dresses and pearl necklaces, not only to look good for their husbands, which was a part of the patriarchal values of the time, but to look good for America as well, to show we have a higher standard of living than in the Soviet Union, where people don't have as many clothing choices. And of course, these suburbs are accessed via automobiles, and they're going to contribute to increased sprawling of cities, which, some Americans don't want to live in big cities because they're concerned about pollution, they're concerned about environmental degradation, and they're concerned about nuclear attacks. And some don't want to live in cities because they don't want to live near minorities as well. That also is a true thing that some Americans thought about as they were moving out to the suburbs. And while there is a lot of optimism in this Cold War period, a belief in a better future, in optimism about technological innovations, there is a lot of fear that happens in the Cold War years. Some families will actually build bomb shelters in their suburban backyards. These are some images from 1950 of students in LA practicing a bombing drill. And on the left-hand side is a family in their bomb shelter from about 1955. I will say, though, that these bomb shelters, they become less common by the early 1960s, largely because the bombs get to be so big and so powerful, and missile systems improve, that the idea is these shelters won't even protect you from a bombing. Also, as time goes on, people will become aware of how dangerous nuclear radiation is. So your bomb shelter might protect you from the initial blast, but what are you going to do once you run out of food? Are you going to go out and die from radiation sickness? I think some Americans give up on the idea of bomb shelters, certainly by the early 60s. I do want to talk a bit more about the stats on home ownership. Home ownership has been a goal for everyday Americans for a very long time, really in some ways since the founding of the country. This goes back to the Homestead Act of 1862, in which you could get free land out west if you could live there for 5 years. There's earlier legislation as well that made land purchases much cheaper for everyday Americans too. I talk about it in my AMH 2010 course. There's not a lot of hard data on home ownership though, pre-1890. But before the 1930s, the typical down payment on a home was usually 50 to 70%. Having a mortgage was not something that you wanted to be seen to have in this period. It was almost seen as being almost embarrassing. There's evidence of that in the scholarship, that people would almost rather rent than own a home with a mortgage. It's better to buy up front, or at least make a very large down payment. That changes though after World War II with the VA loans that are zeroed down with a 20-year mortgage. It normalizes home mortgages, which had been becoming more common also in the 1930s with the founding of the FHA. And homeownership was not as available in the early 20th century because America is urbanizing, people are moving to the cities. But after World War II, with the development of highway systems, you see a massive surge in homeownership as people are able to live in suburban homes and contribute or commute into work in the cities. And you can see the end of World War II is right about here, and homeownership reaches its highest point actually in the mid 2000s, right before the 2008 financial crisis. I should also add that the home ownership is not just made available by mortgages, but by the type of housing that's built as well. The houses that are being built were much smaller than the suburban homes that are built today. Bill Levitt's Levittown, like in New York, these were model suburban communities. These houses are much smaller. They're typically Levitt's houses in particular, they were on a 25 by 30 foot slab. That works out to about 750 square feet. They usually had a second half story, so maybe 1,500 square feet, but remember it's a half story, kind of like an attic story. So these are starter homes. They're much smaller than the kind of homes we're building today. So that also makes it easier to purchase a home and leads to rapid home ownership purchase. Home ownership in the post-World War II period. If we want to see more people buying homes today, we'd probably have to build a lot more smaller homes like this. These new homes also, they're going to be filled with new appliances. Many of these appliances, the technology had already been around before the post-World War II period, but there's pent-up economic production. These goods were not being made during the war. Companies are making, aircraft and weapons and things like that, but now they need to make civilian products. So they're going to make stoves and refrigerators and vacuum cleaners and televisions for purchase for American consumers. And these products, the technology has actually been around for many years, but they actually become affordable to middle class people now. And in many cases, they are marketed towards women. During this period, women are making about 75% of the purchasing decisions for American households. This is part of their duties as a soldier for the country, like their husbands. They have to buy the right kind of refrigerator for their house, the right kind of stove. Everything should be color coordinated, femineered, as this one ad here says. And televisions also become more common during this period. By the end of the 1950s, the majority of American households will have TVs. So what are people cooking in their new kitchens, in their new suburban homes? Well, here are some mid-century recipes. These really are the intersection of Depression and World War II era frugality, where people didn't have as much money for spending on food. They had ration books. They had to use processed foods that were more available, as well as some Northern and Eastern European culinary traditions that were becoming more American, more white, you might even say. And then obviously, finally, labor-saving processed food products. So you have crown roast of frankfurters, of hot dogs, ham and bananas on hollandaise. Bananas are a cheaper food, but they were still seen as kind of exotic at mid-century. Things like head cheese, which is basically organ meat and chopped up animal products that are made into almost like a jello, like gelatinized dish that can be sliced and eaten like on sandwich bread. Even things like savory jello salads. Maybe your grandmother or great grandmother has made these foods for you. Perhaps your mom made you have a slice before you had dessert, and they didn't taste very good to you, but making dishes like these actually was kind of a status symbol in mid-century America. It meant you had the money to buy these new products, things like Jello, or Jello brand gelatin. It also meant you had a refrigerator that was cold enough to actually make Jello set, or to make head cheese set and harden. Because before the post-World War II period, it was more common to have an ice box than a refrigerator. An ice box had a section where big blocks of ice would keep the food cold, but it didn't keep food nearly as cold as an electric refrigerator did. But I mention this because, on average, Americans actually spent more on food in the mid-century period than they do now, yet we don't eat this kind of food anymore. We do eat processed foods today, but we eat different kinds of processed foods, not Jello. We eat other things. I also mention this as well because when people get very nostalgic about the mid-century period, um, you see this in some of the online communities like the so-called tradwife community, for example. You see them making these really amazing from scratch recipes that would be very difficult to make from scratch. Um, but that's not really what people were doing in the mid-century period. They wanted to save labor. They wanted to use processed and canned foods. That way, women would have more time for other tasks like cleaning the house. You could spend less time cooking, more time cleaning and nurturing your children. So we often remember the past a lot more nostalgically than it actually was. And I certainly do not want to return to some of the foods they were eating in the mid-century period. How's this for an intersection between defense technology and consumer capitalism? The microwave was accidentally discovered by Percy Spencer, a researcher for Raytheon, back in 1946. And this device used microwaves to heat up food. Um, the first model was $5,000, which would be well over 5 grand in today's money. And they were supposed to be used primarily by restaurants to cook food quickly. I mean, I can't imagine eating a steak cooked in a microwave. That'd be like eating a rubber tire. But microwaves don't really become affordable for everyday Americans till the mid 1960s. And that's actually when Amana introduced a model that was about $500, which would be a few $1,000s in today's money. So, as I said, there's a push for labor-saving technology when it comes to cooking. It's really not a from scratch period. I want to do a quick now and then discussion of the American dream. Um, The term American Dream was first used in 1931 by James Adams in the book The Epic of America, and basically he argued that the American Dream was living in a society where you could reach your full potential, regardless of your identity or your background. But in recent years, the term has become conflated with being middle class. Um, and middle class culture was seen as the best American culture, really from the 1800s on, and it really gets cemented though as the prime dominant American culture though after World War II. And the idea is the American dream meant being middle class. It meant owning a home. It meant supporting your family comfortably on a single income. It could mean being able to take an annual vacation, things of that nature, being able to participate in this capitalist consumer economy. And I have some stats from the early to mid 2020s, which will compare to the late 1950s. To begin, the average home in about 2023, and these numbers will change a little bit as you get into 2024 and 2025. On average, they're about 2,000 square feet, and it will cost you about $416,000. It's actually a little bit higher now, but there's also quite a bit of variety depending on where in the country you go. If you go to a place like California, the average home is going to cost considerably more. If you go to parts of the Southeast or the West, a home will cost considerably less. The average car price, this is about $48,000. This includes car purchases, so it's going to include both new and used cars. And for college education, I use University of Pennsylvania. They are a very expensive elite Ivy League school, but they're very transparent about their tuition costs over time. The annual tuition, classes, room, board, books, etc., is going to be about 58 and a half or 58,620 specifically. Definitely not cheap. The average household income is about $75,000 to $80,000, but the average household achieves that income on a dual system where both parents are working outside of the home. Only about 25% of American families are single income dual parent. Now we'll compare this with the end of the 1950s. This is from about 1959, 1960, solidly in this mid-century period. The average home was 983 square feet, so what we would think of as starter homes. Remember, Levitt's original model was a 750 square foot home with a second floor that was kind of like a half floor. It was the attic floor. These homes could be picked up for about $12,000, which is about $125,000 in today's money. And homes in the 1950s, basically, they're about half the size of modern homes, but they're less than a third of the cost. The average car price in this late 50s, early 60s period is about $3,000 or about 31,000 in today's money. So considerably less for a car as well. And then tuition for UPenn in 1959, it's about $1,250 or about $13,000 in today's money. And the average household income in this period was $5,400 or about $57,000 today. But this is less money than the average household brings today, but 70% of households were single income, dual parent, usually the father working outside of the home, bringing in money for the family. So homes are considerably cheaper, even if they're smaller. Automobiles are considerably cheaper as well. And your college tuition is considerably cheaper as well. Now, remember, homes are smaller. Their appliances are less sophisticated. They don't have things like granite countertops. In some cases, they don't even have central air conditioning. Automobiles, while they look really cool, they're less sophisticated. They're less safe than the cars of today. And college tuition was considerably cheaper in this mid-century period, but colleges and universities did not have the amenities that colleges and universities have today. Fancy gyms, really nice dining halls. If you look at dormitories built in the 1950s, 1960s, they're almost like prison cells. When I've seen dorms at older colleges, I'm like, these are places I would not want to stay. And have to share a bathroom with an entire floor of other college students. So some of the things you're buying today, they're nicer, but they are a lot more expensive. And I would say disproportionately more expensive considering their size and considering their overall value. There are some things, though, that were more expensive proportionally in the past. People did spend more on average on their food and on their clothing, even though they're eating a lot of processed foods in the mid-century period. Also, they're spending more on consumer goods and technology because a lot of it's made in the United States as opposed to being imported from other parts of the world. For example, a color TV would have cost you $300 in 1960. That'd be about $2,400 in today's money. That's a very small TV with a 12 to 16-inch screen. It only gets a few channels. Nowadays, I bought a 52-inch TV for $250, and it connects to the internet. I can play video games on it, things that would have been almost unimaginable in the 1950s and early 60s. So in some ways, things are better. In other ways, things are worse. I guess what really trips people up the most, though, now versus then, is that your three biggest purchases, your car, your house, and your college education, are proportionately considerably more expensive today than they were at mid-century. Here are a couple more quick stats about mid-century American culture and technology. Refrigerators and built-in freezers and electric stoves made cooking and homemaking a lot easier for women who were dropping out of the workforce and becoming housewives. Just because you're not working outside the home doesn't mean the work ends, though. You have products like Jell-O, you have flash freezing, you have processed foods that make cooking easier, although not necessarily more appetizing. The idea is you can take that time and put it towards other services for your family. Televisions, of course, become more common during this period. The technology was invented late 1920s, early 1930s, but it becomes cheaper and more efficient after World War II. By 1962, towards the end of this mid-century period, 90% of American households will have their own TV set. Vacuum cleaners, the technology had been around before the mid-century period, but they became less expensive as time went on. The Hoover Company introduced the Model 29 vacuum, which they would sell to housewives actually in home demonstrations. The salesman would do things like knock on your door, and of course, in those days, you let a traveling salesman into your house. It's not like nowadays where you'd pretend to not be home. You had to let people in because if you were too suspicious, that might be a hint that possibly you were a communist or up to no good. The salesman would throw a small piece of dirt on your rug, would offer to clean it up, and then you would buy the vacuum. So sales tactics were a big thing in the 1950s. There's a great I Love Lucy skit about it in an episode called Sales Resistance, in which she buys a vacuum after being subject to sales tactics like what I've mentioned before. And as I said, many of these new products were marketed towards women, especially middle-class homemakers who are accounting for about 75% of the domestic purchasing. And these new technologies, they promise to make women's housework easier and to free them from what are often seen as the drudgeries of homemaking and working hard for your family. The thing is, though, in many ways, these new technologies, they will raise the bar on the amount of housework and homemaking that women are expected to do. And of course, many working class women, they might still face these pressures as well, but they cannot afford these labor-saving technologies. There were also labor-saving technologies that were developed for men as well, things like gasoline-powered lawnmowers, for example, which men are going to use to maintain the exterior of their suburban homes. And what you find is this. Work hours for men went down considerably from the turn of the century and sort of the Gilded Age era to the post-World War II era. You went from 55 to 60 hours of work per week for men down to about 39 to 41 hours per week without a whole lot of variety. Nowadays, the average American works 34 to 38 hours a week, so there's actually a lot more variety, even if the hours overall are lower. At the turn of the century, women on average worked about 58 hours a week, and at the turn of the century, America is not it's not a predominantly urban nation yet, so there's still a lot more agrarian workers and small craft industry workers. A lot of women's work actually was a part of the economic production of the household. It wasn't just homemaking. And they were working on average about 58 hours a week. So sometimes working more than the men in their lives, sometimes working a bit less. For men, there was more of a variety of 55 to 60 hours a week. Moving to the mid-century period, men are working outside of the home. 70% of American households are single income. Usually it's the man working outside of the home. They're working 39 to 41 hours outside of the home. And domestically, they're only doing about 5 to 10 hours of domestic work per week. On average, about 5 hours of lawn mowing and basic kind of weekly maintenance, and then perhaps another 5 hours a week doing things like, fixing the leaky toilet, for example. Home maintenance that's not done as regularly, but still has to be done. And those jobs typically, under the gender norms of the period, are done by men. Women, however, have had significant labor-saving technologies develop, but the amount of work that they are doing around the house has not fallen at the same rate that it's fallen for men. So women are still typically working 25 to 30 hours on their domestic work, even if they're less likely to work outside the home. Their working hours have not really fallen commensurate with the labor-saving technologies that are being sold to them, really because the bar for cleanliness and the bar for good homemaking is being increased. And this is going to lead to a lot of frustration and discontent with many American women, and in some ways is going to help to bring about the second wave feminist movement in the 1960s and 1970s. This is the kitchen debate of 1959, in which Vice President Richard Nixon challenged Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to a impromptu debate about capitalism and communism, using a model kitchen as an example of the ingenuities of American capitalism. This is what happened. On July 24th, 1959, U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon showed Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev a model home display at the American National Exhibition in Moscow. This is a part of the ideological Cold War. the competition of ideas of capitalism versus communism. The interaction was filmed, and it featured Nixon demonstrating the use of American-made labor-saving and entertainment devices, brought to the American people by capitalism and by free markets. The meeting was called the Kitchen Debate, and Nixon extolled the benefits of American capitalism. If you watch it, he uses a very friendly, almost cloying manner. Khrushchev admired the goods, but I think he was sort of taken aback by it. I think he was almost ambushed, and he questioned why the U.S. needed to offer so many options to consumers. The Soviet Union, Khrushchev argued, offered its people fewer choices, but then it could put its efforts into big, centrally planned projects like its space program, which the Soviets were in the lead in the space race in the 1950s. And Nixon's interactions with Khrushchev were filmed, and these broadcasts were shown in both the U.S. and the USSR, with each side kind of claiming victory. And the kitchen debate did make Nixon very popular in the United States, and it really bolstered his future campaign for president in 1960. There's also evidence as well that Khrushchev was impressed by Nixon and did not want Nixon to ever become president of the United States because he would be a very dangerous opponent. With the time left in this video, I want to talk about young people in this mid-century period, specifically the baby boomer generation. They were born from 1945 or 1946, basically the end of World War II, till about 1964. There actually is some evidence that fertility rates increased towards the end of the Great Depression, before World War II even began, but the really big increase in fertility that we know as the baby boom in America, it begins after World War II. And during this period of end of World War II to 1964, about 76 million Americans are born in this period. The baby boomers are the biggest generation in American history, and so there's some significant concerns about what's going to happen to the future of America as this largest American generation is going to get older, and by 2030 they're all going to be over the age of 65. Just for context, other generations are considerably smaller. The World War II generation, which is known as the greatest or builder generation, there's about 63 million of them. The silent generation, which was born from 1928 to 1945, they're kind of born during the Great Depression and during World War II. They're a smaller generation because people were focusing more on just basic survival than on enlarging their families during the Depression and war years. After the boomers comes Generation X, born 1965 to 1980. There's about 65 million of them, and they're a very interesting group of people that we'll talk about in a future video. And then there's Generation Y, or the Millennials, which I'm a member of. They were born from 1981 to 1996, and there's 72 million millennials. There's more millennials than there are Gen Xers because in many cases the millennials are the children of the baby boomers, who were already a very big generation. Then you have Generation Z, they're 1997 to 2012, and there's about 69 million of them. They're a slightly smaller generation than the millennials because birth rates have been declining in America for many years. And Generation Alpha, they begin to be born in 2013, and they're still being born. There's about 43 million of them so far. The boomers being the biggest generation in American history, they've been very well represented, you would say, in politics. There are 4 boomer presidents, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. And actually, Clinton, W. Bush, and Trump are all a few months apart in age. They were all born in 1946, making them older boomers, about the oldest you can be in still being a boomer. Obama was actually born in 61. He's born in a different part of the baby boomer generation. He's one of the later baby boomers. Sometimes these later boomers who were born from like the mid 50s to about 1965, which actually kind of cuts into Generation X a bit, they're sometimes called Generation Jones because they were jonesing to keep up with the Joneses. They were very concerned with social status, but they had a harder time having upward mobility because they came of age in the 1970s in a period of economic decline in America, not like the growth of the 50s and 60s. And even though they're technically a part of the baby boomer generation, they lived in a very different world than the early boomers who were born in the the 40s and early 50s. The last thing I should point out too is that the biggest year for baby boomers was actually not right after World War II. It was actually 1957 to 1958. So if you're going to run into a baby boomer, most likely they were born in the mid to late 50s. And this generational stuff is interesting because there are defining moments that will impact generations, how they come of age, how they enter the workforce, how they look at the world. But it does get to be a bit arbitrary as well because my parents, for example, my dad is born in 64, which technically makes him a boomer. My mom is born in 65, which technically makes her a Generation Xer. But if you ever tell my dad that he's a boomer, he gets really, really upset. And in some ways, he has more in common with Gen X than he does with the baby boomer generation. And my own family, I am a millennial, but my younger siblings are Generation Z. So if people are being born in between these generations, they kind of don't quite fit into either generation. And that's why you have the late boomers being called Generation Jones. Some of the young millennials or old millennials, young Gen Xers are called they're called X-lennials, and the oldest Gen Z and youngest millennials is called Zillennials. So demographics can be very interesting, but it can't explain everything. And as I said before, scholars and demographers in recent years have shown that the baby boom began before World War II, but it really accelerates at the end of the war. But why? Was it economic prosperity after the war? Some people say that was the reason. Others say it was American servicemen returning home, wanting to start families, young women wanting to start families with them. Some have suggested lower maternal and infant mortality rates after World War II. Military technologies and warfare lead often to medical advancements, particularly in things like antibiotics, that make childbirth a lot safer, and that would lead to women wanting to have more children. And some would also say that suburbanization, the mass suburbanization, made it easier to have more children because you can spread out into your backyard. You can have a second floor for your kids' bedrooms, and it's just easier to have children if you're living in a suburban home than if you're living in an urban apartment. And I think all of these factors can explain the baby boom after World War II. I don't think any one of them is more important than the others. I think they all work together to help to create the baby boom, the biggest generation in American history. And the baby boom and their generation, the boomers, they're an interesting group of people because in some ways they were the first generation in American history and really in world history to be seen as a unique adolescent demographic, the teenager demographic that should be marketed to, that should have its own unique identity that's different from children and different from adults. Adolescents have always existed, but the idea that being an adolescent means you're something that's sort of a liminal space between children and adults, that's a very new development in world and American history. And the economic prosperity of the post-war period makes this marketing possible and really makes it possible for young people to engage in this youth culture. You have subcultures, you have jocks who play sports, motorheads who work on cars, greasers who ride motorcycles. You have films and media that are targeted towards young people, new types of fashion that are marketed towards young people, and new types of music as well, including rock and roll music. Rock and roll was really originally an African American style, but it was adopted by white performers like Elvis Presley. This is a still from his famous Jailhouse Rock song, 1956 to 1957, and the way he moved his hips when he danced was considered to be too risque in the 1950s. So when he was on television shows like the Ed Sullivan Show, they would only film him from the waist up rather than risk being taken off the air. Here are some examples of fashion that was marketed towards young people, towards baby boomers, and also to some of the younger silent generation members as well. During World War II, there were cloth shortages, so women's skirts became shorter and tighter. They still remained a little bit on the shorter side after the war, but instead they were made to flare out and to really use as much cloth as possible to have layers and petticoats and things like that, because it shows prosperity. It shows you have the cloth to basically to waste on these large skirts, and you'll have little appliques like the poodle applique will be added, which is why they're often called poodle skirts. Young men are sold denim jeans and leather jackets. You want to look tough. You want to look masculine, like your father who was in the war. Granted, you wouldn't wear skirts that were too short or jeans or leather jackets to school. If you did, you would have gotten thrown out of school. Freedom of expression was more curtailed in this period than it is in later parts of American history. There is a pressure for consistency and for engaging with American consumer culture and the technocracy, but there also, you would say, is a pressure to conform as well. Everyone's a soldier. Everyone has to be on the same page if we're going to defeat communism, both militarily and ideologically. While many young people engaged in this consumer culture and these mainstream subcultures, not all youths did. And I would say this is more members of the silent generation, the younger members of the silent generation. Some of them get involved in what is called the beat culture or the beatnik culture. The term beatnik, adding "nick" to the end of something implies that it's foreign and it's even Russian and not to be trusted. And the beat culture, they, in some ways, are a lot like the hippies that emerged in the 1960s. They weren't interested in consumerism and in capitalism. They were much more interested in having a good time and pursuing art and poetry and living in urban centers rather than the suburbs. Here are some examples of media that comes out of the Beat generation. On the Road and Other Novels by Jack Kerouac about young people sort of drifting around the country, rebelling against the middle class consumerist, what they would see as shallow mainstream American culture. I would also consider the poetry of Allen Ginsberg to be a part of this beat movement as well. It comes into the country in 1956. Kerouac, On the Road, is in 1957. And Ginsberg's poems, particularly Howl, were considered to be too graphic and too sexual, and they actually tried to stop copies from being imported into the United States. So again, freedom of expression was curtailed in this period. So because of the economic prosperity and the immense technological and social change of this mid-century period, many older Americans who had fought in World War II, or even who were older than that, were very concerned about young people and the direction American culture was going in. They worried that perhaps the baby boomers had it too good, or that they had too many opportunities. Parents worry about their children's future. Generational anxiety is a feature throughout world history. And many parents were happy that their kids had more economic opportunities than they had, that they hadn't known the suffering of the Great Depression or the fear and the rationing of World War II. Some did think that the kids had it too easy, and they were worried that young boomers would be too weak. They were too focused on pleasure and instant gratification. They thought that young people were getting soft. They had to be tough. They had to be prepared to fight like we did when we were fighting in Europe and the Pacific in World War II. And they thought that young people needed to build character and face adversity as they had. Some of these things every older generation has felt over time. You see this even in ancient civilizations, but it was a very strong, very palpable feeling in mid-century America. And I think when it comes to raising of children, the greatest generation, when they raised the boomers, there was a lack of balance in how they raised their kids. Some parents, I think, were too lenient. They followed the work of people like Dr. Benjamin Spock, not the Star Trek character, the scientist. And Dr. Spock advocated for a permissive parenting in which you basically treated your children like your friends, and that would be the best way to raise them. Other parents I've found were much too strict. They punished their children when they stepped out of line, when they tested boundaries. In some cases, they were really abusive to their children. And others, I would say this is probably the largest group of parents, the largest cohort, were simply apathetic and just not really very involved in their kids' lives. They didn't give enough advice. They kind of just let the neighborhood raise their children. Their kids played outside, they went to school, and then they came home, and they didn't really interact with their children all that much. And that, I think, was probably the biggest group of people. But none of these parenting methods are very successful. You need to have balance. You do have to understand and empathize with your children, but you have to set clear boundaries with them. And you want children to experience things for themselves and to learn from experience, but you don't want them to get hurt or to not have advice because they're still learning. So I think there was a lack of balance in how young boomers were raised. If you want to know more about middle class American family dynamics, particularly nuclear family dynamics, there are some really interesting television shows from the 50s you can check out. Now, television is television. It's not reality, but it's inspired by reality. You have shows like I Love Lucy, 1951 to 1957, groundbreaking show. Lucille Ball insisted that she would be in the show married to her husband, Desi Arnaz, who was Cuban. That was considered to be very edgy. They were essentially in what would have been considered an interracial relationship at the time. And while there are cultural stereotypes in the show, the show is actually very groundbreaking. Lucille Ball appeared on the show actually pregnant, which was not common at all in the mid-century. Pregnancy was something to be hidden, even though every family was having a larger amount of children. Pregnancy was too suggestive. Also on their show, it featured them in two separate beds, but the beds were pushed together, which again, that was edgy for the time. Other shows that I think are important are shows like Father Knows Best, 1954 to 1960, which, it shows the patriarchal values of the period. And then Leave It to Beaver, 1957 to 1963, which is often cited as being the quintessential mid-century American television show. Of the three shows, though, I think Father Knows Best was probably the most typical of an American family. I Love Lucy, it's about a family that only has one child, and the father is in show business, which is not, a typical industry in this period. Leave It to Beaver was really more of a kid's show than an adult show, and also their family was smaller. They only had two children. The norm in this period would have been to have more like three children. And on Father Knows Best, the family had more children. And the humor and jokes on Father Knows Best were less slapstick and physical comedy based compared to what you would see in like Leave It to Beaver or I Love Lucy. On the big screen in mid-century America, war movies, especially about World War II, and westerns were very popular. American adults wanted to see movies about the war that they had participated in. Young people wanted to see movies about the war that they had heard about from their parents. Westerns were very popular as well because Americans at mid-century liked to compare their struggles in World War II and in the Cold War to the struggles of the Americans that had conquered and integrated the West. And really, westerns in like the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, they're kind of what like superhero movies are in the late 2000s and 2010s. They were popular for many years, but eventually they do begin to die out, as I think is happening with superhero movies as of 2025. Generational anxiety is a big feature in these films. It's a reason why the westerns are popular. Adult Americans are looking to a more difficult but more noble past, and they want young people to be inspired by the message of the past when men were men and women were women, and we had simpler problems to deal with. And you can see this masculine ideal in the acting of people like John Wayne and Gary Cooper and many others. Um, and there was a degree of self-censorship, though, in Hollywood. You had the Hays Code, which was in effect from the 1930s until the late 1960s. This was a form of self-censorship. Hays Code films would avoid cursing. the villain would always have to get his comeuppance in the end. Villains could not be shown to be too sympathetic, and the idea was they wanted to avoid anything that could be subversive or could lead to film boycotts. This was the era of the Cold War. While the Hays Code was around in the 30s, it continues into the post-World War II period. You don't want to do anything that could possibly make America or American culture seem defective. And if we're talking about films that exemplify the generation gap, yes, you have the Westerns, yes, you have the World War II movies, but I think the 1955 picture Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean, really shows generational anxiety. Dean in the movie, he plays a character named Jim, who is a naive but rebellious teenager who is really basically estranged from his father, and he falls in with a bad crowd. The film's message really is that young people are aimless and they're rebellious, but they need strong and understanding guidance from older people. They need an example from their parents, and that really young people actually want this. You just have to be there and actually do it as a parent. And the film was a massive financial success. It spoke to both younger people who identified with James Dean's character Jim, and it spoke to older people as well who identified with his parents. And Dean was very tragically killed in a car accident shortly before the film was released, so people wanted to see his last work on screen. And these films in the 1950s, they show the undercurrents of social anxiety that many Americans were feeling as a result of the Cold War. The Red Scares, the fear of communism, changing race relations, and generation gaps, even the Lavender Scare. Some people have suggested that the reason Dean died was it was not an accident, that it was actually that he ended his own life because he was going to be outed as gay. Some people suggest that. Here are a couple of quick scenes from Rebel Without a Cause. Um, Jim's father is a weak, effeminate man. He wears an apron and he does household chores. He tries to connect with his son, but his son does not respect him. He's a weak parent, a weak disciplinarian, and Jim gets into trouble. He and his friends, they take cars and they drive them off of cliffs and they jump out at the last minute. Dean survives, but the other person that he's racing, he doesn't get out of his car in time and dies. And basically the movie is saying that young people, they need a strong role model, and particularly sons need a strong masculine male role model, and that this is not only what they need, it's what they want as well. And this movie resonated with both young people and older people. Conclusion. The early Cold War years were a dynamic period of massive social, political, and technological change. It's a period of great excitement, prosperity, and optimism, but it's also a time of anxiety as well, rather paradoxically, because there's a lot of social pressure to conform to mainstream American values and ideals. You have to do this to prove that capitalism in America and that American versions of democracy are the best. And many Americans in the present, from a variety of political perspectives, both right and left, they have a nostalgic opinion about the mid-century period. You have younger people, trying out the trad wife lifestyle. You have younger people talking about how, back in the 50s you could buy a house for a firm handshake and things like that. So there is a nostalgia for this period that's understandable, but not always rooted in an actual understanding of the period. And while there are many good things about this mid-century period, housing being more affordable, well-paying jobs being more available, there was a lot of challenges as well that people would not like to bring back. There was a manufactured cultural consensus. There was a desire for curation and consistency that edged into a pressure to conform. And while Americans had been encouraged to be very frugal and austere during the Depression and during World War II, they're now encouraged to live their life to the fullest and participate in the capitalist consumer economy, which it's to show how much better American capitalism is. But some younger people recognize that there is a shallowness to this consumerist lifestyle. Um, and then, of course, not all of these elements of consumer culture are as available to all Americans. And so I would say there are positives and there are negatives to this mid-century period. There are things that we would like to bring back, affordability in housing, for example, but there are other things we would want to leave behind. The pressure to conform, the discrimination that certain groups faced in this period, and of course the fear that Americans lived with about mutually assured destruction. Those are things we would not want to bring back today. And finally, the optimism of this period is going to crack as time goes on.